to night, while the room grows softer and the edges of the day begin to loosen. Settle in softly now and let your breathing follow the hush of tidewater, the creak of old rope, and the patient swing of lantern light as Sinbad drifts once more toward one of the gentler, lesser-known voyages of his youth. In those earlier years, before merchants in distant ports had learned to lift their brows at his name, Sinbad was not yet the man later storytellers liked to polish into legend. He was younger then, though already formed by water. He was perhaps 29, perhaps a little past that, at an age when the hands have grown practiced, but the heart is still learning what matters enough to keep. He understood cargo, hulls, winds, contracts, mooring stones, the grain of cedar crates, the brittle softness of paper that had taken too much damp, the way saffron perfumed a storeroom, even through sealed wrappings, and the quiet note a sound jar made when shifted beside a cracked one. If these gentle stories help you relax, unwind, and drift into rest, you can subscribe for more like this. He lived in Basra then, in a narrow house above a merchant's counting room, not far from the quieter branch of the harbor, where smaller vessels came and went with practical goods rather than proud display. He had known longer voyages already, and enough of the wide sea to keep him from vanity. Yet he had not become hardened by trade. That was one of his gifts. He could still pause at the smell of lamp oil warming in brass, or at the sight of woven sails hanging at dawn like folded wings, or at the murmuring knock of hull against quay in the hour before sunrise, when even busy harbors seemed to breathe more slowly. Basra in those days was full of motions so constant that many people stopped noticing them. Sinbad did not stop noticing. He still looked. He looked at porters carrying cinnamon wrapped in coarse cloth and at scribes dipping reeds into black ink beneath awnings striped by old weather. He watched fishermen coming up river with silver catch and reed baskets, and bargemen with wet hems, knotting rope that smelled of salt and mud together. He watched potter's boys unloading water jars, date sellers spreading woven mats over stacks of fruit, dark as polished wood, and lamp makers holding glass chimneys up to the light to see whether any flaw lived within them. At dusk, he liked the harbor best. By then, the sun had softened into copper over the river, and the louder bargains were mostly done. Sails turned from white to rose, then to gray. A little cooking smoke lifted from deck braziers. Oars touched water with the softness of quiet speech. Lamps bloomed one by one under balconies and in counting rooms, and at the prows of boats intending to leave with the tide before dawn. He was, in those years, building his life as much by attention as by ambition. He held shares in a few modest voyages. He knew 3 captains well enough to trust their temperaments, and 2 others well enough to distrust them politely. He bought paper from a careful dealer whose store was always dry, and indigo from a man who never lied about fading. He could tell at a glance whether a crate of glazed bowls had been packed by someone who respected roads and tides, or by someone who thought straw alone was a form of wisdom. He had learned, too, that small roots often outlasted celebrated ones in usefulness, because they were traveled by people who valued necessity more than boasting. It was this habit of looking toward smaller roots that led him, one quiet evening, to hear first of the islands that drifted away. The evening had no omen upon it. It was a mild one. A thin pearl haze rested over the river, and the breeze from the Gulf had come in, gentle enough to carry the smell of salt above the warmer city scents of cumin, cedar dust, wool, and lamp smoke. Sinbad had finished a plain supper of lentils and flatbread, and was making his way through the upper rope-maker's quarter, where alleys narrowed, shadows held coolness, and small maritime shops remained open after dark for captains who always remembered one more need. He meant only to buy a bundle of waxed cord, a set of bronze hooks, and perhaps a spare lamp chimney if the price proved fair. In that quarter there stood a tea-room so small that one might miss it entirely if not for the polished brass kettle hanging by the door and the old fig tree that leaned protectively over its roof. Sailors, chart readers, coopers, and quiet merchants sometimes sat there because the tea was good, and the woman who kept the place never hurried anyone's silence. Sinbad had often stopped there for a cup before returning to his rooms. When he entered that evening, only 2 customers were inside. One was a net mender from the South Quay, half asleep over his bowl, and the other was an old man seated by the lattice window with a folded bundle of parchment at his side and a narrow wooden staff resting against his knee. He wore a cloak the color of weathered sand and a simple turban wound without any wish to impress. His face was lean and deeply lined, not from bitterness, but from years of looking at horizons where light and water change slowly. His beard was white, trimmed close. His hands, lying loosely upon the table, were those of someone who had held both rope and pens in equal measure. Sinbad knew him by sight, as many harbor-men did, though few spoke of him often. His name was Ibrahim al-Muwayyid, though some of the older pilots called him simply the keeper of slow charts. He was said to be 83. In his youth, he had served as a navigator on coastal vessels that favored intricate island routes over broad open passages, and later had spent long years copying and correcting shoal maps, tide tables, and harbor notes for merchants, sensible enough to value such things. His reputation was not grand, which in matters of navigation often means it was good. The tea-woman brought Sinbad a cup without asking, for she knew his habits, and because there was no other sensible seat, she placed him at the table beside Ibrahim. For a little while they drank in silence. Outside, a donkey passed slowly, the bells on its harness giving a muted silver note. Somewhere above the alley, someone was shaking a rug out of an upper window. The air smelled of mint, steam, and a distant river damp, and the old man untied the cord around his parchment bundle and slid one folded chart slightly free, not opening it yet, only laying his palm upon it, as if feeling whether it wished to be opened. At last he said, in a voice so dry and quiet that one had to lean into stillness to hear it, "You are Yusuf ibn Harun's son." "I am," Sinbad said. "Your father once bought a tide chart from me and ignored half of it." There was no accusation in the statement, only memory. Sinbad smiled softly. He did that with many useful things, especially if they contradicted his preferred hour. Ibrahim's mouth moved faintly, not quite into a smile, yet enough to show that he understood and perhaps forgave the dead man his habits. "You read charts more faithfully." "I I try. Trying is already rarer than most men believe. He lifted the folded parchment and opened it with careful fingers. The chart was old, but lovingly kept. Its edges had been mended with thin linen. The ink had browned toward sepia in places. It showed a section of southern coastal water, not far beyond the ordinary coasting lanes, yet not much used now except by fishermen, salt carriers, and those few small captains who still respected patient navigation. The coast there was not simple. It broke into shoals, channels, pale sand tongues, marshy bars, and scattered islands too low to seem permanent in careless weather. Sinbad leaned slightly forward. At first the chart seemed straightforward enough, but then his eye caught the notes along the margins. 2 different island outlines had been drawn in different inks. One set in faded brown, another in blue-gray. Small date marks stood beside them, separated by many years. Farther along the edge were remarks in a hand so fine they almost resembled stitching. South Reed Island farther west by half a watch of rowing. Spring still sweet in cool months, if dug beside tamarisk line. Lantern platform moved after flood season. Do not trust last year's sand where the white birds stand. Sinbad looked more closely. These islands changed. They did, Ibrahim said. Sandbars? Yes, and more than sandbars. He let the chart rest flat. There was once, south of the common coasting line, a chain of low islands used by traders who preferred quiet water and shorter halts. Not rich islands, not grand ports, no customs house worth flattering, no warehouses tall enough to cast a proud shadow, only reeds, pale shell beaches, shallow wells, tamarisk, salt grass, and a handful of seasonal dwellings built of timber, matting, and shell lime. Yet they mattered. Boats carrying spices in small quantity, cloth, paper, glass lamps, lamp oil, dried figs, and plain ceramics used them as resting points. Fishermen sold mullet there. Salt gatherers traded cakes of salt. Rope makers brought reed fiber. Water could be taken. Hulls could rest on soft mud at the right tide for scraping and repitching. And now? Sinbad asked. Ibrahim placed one finger on the blue-gray outline of an island, no larger on the chart than a thumbnail. Now most men say they drifted away. The tea room seemed to settle more quietly around that phrase. The net mender slept on, his chin nearly on his chest. The tea woman refilled a kettle in the back. Outside, evening deepened further in the alley. Sinbad looked again at the chart and saw that what first seemed like 2 maps was actually one place drawn at different times. You mean they eroded? Some, not all. Some lengthened, some narrowed, some broke in 2, some joined one another in flood years, and some walked slowly with current and reed roots. A low island is a patient traveler if you give it enough seasons. Sinbad rested his fingertips lightly on the table, and men abandoned them because they expected land to keep still. Ibrahim's eyes lifted toward him, mild and approving. In part, also because bigger harbors began to promise quicker trade. Also because lanterns were not kept. Also because men like fixed directions, fixed wharves, fixed profit, and fixed memorial. A drifting route demands humility. That quality thins in prosperous decades. Sinbad did not answer at once. The very idea of islands shifting by seasons, rather than standing in obedient permanence, stirred something in him, deeper than curiosity alone. It did not feel like marvel. It felt like a truth of the sea that should have been obvious long before anyone needed to say it aloud. Why should only water move? Why should land at the edge of tides not also learn to travel slowly? Ibrahim opened the chart farther. There, near the center of the shifting chain, a small symbol marked a sheltered anchorage. Around it had once been drawn 5 little islands or island fragments forming a loose crescent. In the later ink, those fragments had altered position. One had thinned into a bar. Another had moved outward. A third no longer appeared at all. Beside the anchorage symbol, in old, careful writing, were 2 words, "Rest of lanterns." Sinbad read them silently. Ibrahim said, "The harbor there was never stone in the way city harbors are stone. That is where later men misunderstood it. They looked for permanence of the wrong kind. The anchorage did not belong to one island alone. It belonged to the relation among several low islands and channels. When those relations changed, the harbor also changed shape, but it did not vanish. It simply required its keepers to move with it. And they did not. For a time, they did. There were families who knew how to shift mooring posts, relocate light baskets, mark the fresh channels, and close the old ones. There was a keeper of current notes. There were reed towers with lantern trays. Not high, but enough to guide a boat through the dusk when bars shone deceptively. Then trade fattened elsewhere. The patient keepers aged. One flood season broke more than 1 tower. A generation passed that preferred still keys and stone wells. The chain was called unreliable. Men said the islands had drifted away, and in saying so relieved themselves of the duty of learning how to find them again. The old man folded his hands over the chart. For a while Sinbad said nothing, because the thought itself required space. At last he asked, "Why tell me?" Ibrahim looked out through the lattice at the dimming alley before answering. "Because I copied these charts for 40 years and amended them for 20 more, and my hands are no longer pleased by the idea that they will go unused. Because I went there when I was younger, and in my age I would like to see whether the chain still keeps any part of its old courtesy. Because I am too old to make such a voyage alone, and too old also to trust it to men who want only a story to take home. And because you are known for looking at ledgers as if places lived behind them." The tea woman set a small dish of preserved lemon peel on the table between them, as if this were a conversation that required brightness as well as tea. Sinbad glanced again at the chart and then at the old man's face. "You wish to go?" "Yes." "When?" "In 8 days, if the river and the coast behave, and if a certain captain remains sensible." "What cargo?" Ibrahim's expression softened almost imperceptibly. The question pleased him because it was the right one. "Small cargo. Cinnamon in sealed packets. 2 chests of saffron. Indigo cakes. Plain cotton. Lamp oil in jars. Reed paper. A crate of glass chimneys. Coils of rope. Copper cups. Cedar pegs. Resin. Nothing so heavy it cannot wait upon patience." "What captain?" "Laith ibn Masud. The vessel is the Evening Gull." Sinbad knew the name. Laith was a coastal captain in his late 50s, perhaps 60, broad-bearded and spare in speech. His boat was known not for speed, but for being dry underfoot and quiet in her rigging, which mariners often prize more highly than beauty. He kept practical crews. He did not overload. He was reputed to dislike both panic and bragging with equal intensity. Sinbad lifted his cup and felt that the tea had cooled while they spoke. "I will think," Ibrahim nodded. "That is what I hoped." Then he retied the chart with slender hands, rose with the help of his staff, and departed into the evening lane as softly as if he were stepping from one room of thought into another. For the rest of that night, the old chart would not leave Sinbad. He crossed the rope-maker's quarter and descended toward the river, where lanterns trembled upon dark water and moored boats shifted with the tide in long, patient arcs. He passed warehouses smelling of pepper and wool, and steps damp from the river's breath, and a boatyard where a man with a small lamp was still planing the edge of an oar. Yet in his mind he saw not Basra, but low islands changing place under gulls and reeds. Lantern trays moved from one platform to another, channels opening where older charts showed land, and men deciding, through laziness more than necessity, that what had become difficult was the same as what had disappeared. And the next morning he went to see Captain Lath. The Evening Gull lay at a quieter quay below the cooper's yard, her hull of dark timber rubbed with oil and salt, her sail furled neatly, her deck uncluttered in the way only well-run vessels manage. 2 jars of lamp oil were being loaded under shade cloth. A stack of cotton bales sat ready at one side. Near the stern, a crate marked for glass was wrapped in extra reed matting. Nothing about the vessel suggested haste. Lath himself stood on the quay with a tally board in one hand and a date pit between his teeth, watching the loading with the tired patience of a man who had spent half his life explaining to younger people that cargo does not become lighter because they wish noon to arrive sooner. His beard had gone mostly gray. His gaze was level and weathered. When Sinbad greeted him, he returned the greeting without flourish. "Ibrahim told me you might come," he said. "I came." "Good. If you sail with me, you work when work is near and stay quiet when quiet helps." "That suits me. We will go southward along the ordinary line first. From there, if the weather remains mild, and the old man's eyes still recognize what the chart remembers, we will turn toward his drifting islands. I will not grind my hull on a sand tongue to satisfy anyone's nostalgia. I would think less of you if you did." Lath's mouth moved slightly. "Then come aboard at dusk and look at the stowage. Men who share cargo shares should know where their profits are sleeping." Sinbad stepped onto the deck and at once felt the character of the boat. Some vessels carry restlessness in their planks. The Evening Gull did not. She was broad enough to feel forgiving underfoot, narrow enough in purpose to remain efficient, and built for the sort of trade that values repeated journeys over dramatic ones. The mast stood true. The lines were sound. The deck boards had the faint, clean smell of recent scraping and oiling. Near the forward shade lay the cargo already aboard: cinnamon, saffron, paper, lamp oil, resin, cotton, copper cups, glazed bowls in straw, 2 bundles of reed matting, and a roll of thin chain likely intended for moorings or crate securing. "It is the right cargo for small islands," Sinbad said. Leith grunted approval. "And not the wrong cargo for changing ones." So it was decided. The days before departure passed in the slow, familiar preparations that gentle voyages require. Sinbad settled his local accounts. He arranged for certain matters in Basra to be handled during his absence, purchased a little extra wick, a small hammer with a short handle fit for careful work, and 2 packets of fine copper mesh that might serve lantern vents if the old island lights proved salvageable. He also bought a length of blue cloth, not costly but sturdy and close woven, for reasons he could not quite have named. It seemed like the kind of cloth that belonged on a coast of reeds and shifting light. On the evening before departure, he visited Ibrahim in his narrow upper room above the map copying shop where he lodged. The room smelled of paper, cedar, lamp smoke, and the faint mineral note of old shells kept in a bowl. Charts lined one wall in cloth wrappers. A brass astrolabe hung by the window. A sand table, low and square, held a stylus. Pebbles and bits of reed used to model channels when words were not enough. Ibrahim was seated on a mat, mending the edge of a cloth chart case with waxed thread. He looked up when Sinbad entered and nodded toward the sand table. "Sit. The islands are easier to discuss when they can move." So they talked there by lamplight, not over abstract lines alone, but over a little modeled geography of pebbles, sand ridges, reed fragments, and shallow scoops for channels. Ibrahim showed him how the chain had once lain in a curve that sheltered the anchorage from the deeper swell, and how, after 3 heavy flood seasons, the westernmost reed island had lengthened and then split, leaving a new cut where none had been before. He showed how a channel that on one generation's chart served as the main inward passage later became a trap for those who mistook old soundings for current truth. He explained that the islands did not drift in the manner of logs or boats. They shifted through years by accretion and surrender, sand gathering around roots, reed beds catching silt, a storm biting one shore and laying new ground along another, freshwater seep moving, bird colonies settling, then departing. "In a way," Ibrahim said, drawing one line smooth with the stylus and remaking it slightly farther west, "the islands are always becoming one another." The idea delighted Sinbad with its quiet strangeness. "Then what counts as the same island?" he asked. "The name people keep for it," Ibrahim said. "Or the well, or the tamarisk line, or the place where certain birds return, or the shelf of firmer sand under the reeds. There is no single answer. That is one lesson of such places." Another lesson, it seemed, was that certainty could be softened without becoming useless. Sinbad found that pleasing. They departed at dawn 2 mornings later. The river held a pale mist close to its surface, and the city behind them looked at first like a series of softened shapes rising from water rather than from land. The evening gull moved away from the quay with hardly a complaint from her ropes. Leith gave a few low commands. The crew answered in the same manner. Ibrahim sat near the mast on a folded wool cloak, his chart case beside him, and his staff laid lengthwise along the deck. Sinbad stood for a few moments at the stern, watching Basra loosen into distance. And there were 6 crew besides captain and passengers. Hamad, the cook, carried warmth with him even before he lit the brazier. Sulaim, the rope master, had hands broad and calm as kneaded dough. Rashid, another Rashid, younger than the cook of the Quiet Faith and far more talkative in bursts, tended sail stitching and small repairs. Nabil watched the water with a sound line in one hand. So often it seemed part of his own arm. Tariq, older than the rest except Laith, held the tiller in shifts and spoke mostly to currents under his breath. And little Sabir, not truly little but young enough to blush when addressed by strangers, climbed rigging, fetched tools, and listened with the full-body seriousness of youth, entrusted at last with real work. The first days were not unusual, which is to say they were full of small maritime beauties that cease to seem unusual only to those who have forgotten how to look. The river widened into the gulf. The water changed color by hour and weather, now brown-green from the river's long hand, now steel blue, now silver under veiled noon. Flying fish startled before the bow and flashed briefly like thrown shards of mirror. Birds passed in low lines toward invisible marshes. At dusk, the sail turned rose, then ash, then almost violet. Hamad's little cooking fire perfumed the evening with lentils, onions, and a trace of cumin. Lanterns were lit aboard only as needed. Sometimes Ibrahim unfolded a chart, but more often he simply watched. He was a quiet guide in the truest sense. He did not lecture. He did not fill the deck with stories. He taught by what he noticed, and by allowing Sinbad to notice after him. There, he would say softly, pointing not at an object but at a color change beneath the water. Or, smell that. The shallows are nearer than the chart suggests. Or, do you see the birds holding one line, then changing all at once? Something beneath them has altered. At night he showed Sinbad again the old disciplines of reading stars not as ornaments, but as relations. The astrolabe appeared on clear evenings, cool brass in the lantern light. Ibrahim's hands were steadier with it than many younger men's. He placed it in Sinbad's palms, corrected the angle of his wrist, and reminded him that no measurement improves because it is hurried. Sea roots, he said once, very softly, while the rest of the crew settled toward sleep, and the vessel breathed on in dark water, are made of patience twice, first when learning them, then when refusing to pretend one has learned them completely. Sinbad carried that sentence within him for days. By the 6th morning, they had turned southward beyond the better-known line, into water fewer merchant hulls troubled, except in certain seasons. The coast there lowered and flattened. Marsh birds appeared in pairs and threes. Light lay differently on the sea. Even Laith seemed to speak less, as though speech itself should make room for watching. Toward afternoon, Ibrahim asked for the southern chart. He spread it on the deck between 2 cargo crates and weighted the edges with smooth stones. The old brown island outlines and the later blue-gray corrections seemed almost to move in the changing light. Ibrahim compared them with the horizon, then with the tide, and then with a cluster of low white birds rising in the distance. He did not decide quickly, which reassured Sinbad more than any show of confidence would have done. At length he lifted one hand and pointed. "There. Do you see what looks like pale water holding still?" At first Sinbad saw only brightness. Then the brightness resolved into something more structured. A long, low bar, not entirely submerged, with reeds along one side and a little line of dark brush farther back. "One island," he said. "Perhaps," Ibrahim replied, "or perhaps what is left of two." As the evening gull drew nearer, more shapes emerged. Another low strip beyond the first, a darker seam of water between them. Farther outward, a crescent of pale sand on which gulls stood facing the same direction, their bodies all turned slightly into the breeze. Beyond that, felt almost invisible until one stopped trying too hard to see it. A band of tamarisk no higher than a man's shoulder. The old chart had not lied. It had merely aged. Lath reduced sail. Nabil took soundings. The water here was trickier, not dangerous in the way later storytellers might insist upon, but requiring honest attention. Depth altered gently and often. What looked like safe brightness might rest on a sand tongue shallow enough to kiss the hull unpleasantly, while the darker seam beside it might hold a good lane inward. Sabir moved softly, as if his feet too should not disturb the deck's concentration. By late afternoon, they had sighted no fewer than 5 low islands or island fragments, though whether these corresponded to the chart's old names, no one could yet say. They seemed not so much scattered as loosely conversing across water and current. One carried a thick stand of reeds, silver green in the wind. Another was mostly pale sand with a single wind-bent tamarisk and a necklace of shells at the rack line. A third had a higher center of firmer ground, where old stakes protruded. Farther back, half hidden, lay what might once have been a dwelling platform or storage patch raised above the flood line. Its matting long gone, but the darker rectangle of its earth foundation still faintly visible. "They did not drift away," Sinbad murmured. Ibrahim beside him adjusted the edge of his cloak. "No, they changed their minds about where they wished to be." The remark held no mockery, only respect. They did not attempt the anchorage immediately. Light was too advanced in the day, and Lath was not a man to test unfamiliar shallows because beauty had made the hour seem generous. Instead, he brought the vessel to rest in a safer outer depth between 2 islands, where the evening remained calm enough for a light supper and a long watch. From there, they could observe the chain at dusk. It was in dusk that the drifting islands truly revealed their character. As the sun lowered, pale sand dimmed to pearl. Reed beds turned from green to silver gray. The channels darkened, then began catching sky in ribbons of rose and copper. Birds changed their places. Those on the outer bars lifted and flew inward. Those on the reeds settled lower. One could see then, more clearly than by day, how the islands were less separate objects than intervals in a shifting composition of land and water. Here a channel widened between reeds. There a sand spit joined what had seemed divided. One island shadow lay across another as though reminding the eye that boundaries were temporary. Then, just before the last clear light thinned away, Sabir pointed with one slender arm. "There," he whispered. At first, Sinbad thought the boy indicated a cluster of reeds, but when he narrowed his eyes, he saw at the far side of the inner chain a thin, upright line against the dusk, then another. Then, as the light softened further, the faint geometry of something made by hands long ago. A wooden platform, lifted on posts above a narrow island shoulder, leaning slightly, with the remains of a tray or lantern cage at its top. A reed tower, Ibrahim said. Not far from it, half hidden by brush, lay the suggestion of another. And farther in, where the old chart marked rest of lanterns, one could almost believe, if the dusk was kind and one's heart patient, that a sheltered water still waited behind the low islands. That night, no one slept heavily. The chain of islands lay about them under moonlight in pale, shifting forms. The outer bars gleamed, the channels darkened like silk ribbons. Somewhere in the reeds, birds gave small, sleepy sounds. Water touched the hull softly, not with the deep pulls of open coast, but with the many little movements of current meeting current. Sinbad lay on his folded cloak and listened. The islands did not seem silent. They seemed full of gentle rearrangement. Before dawn he woke and found Ibrahim already sitting upright near the bow. The old man had not lit a lamp. He needed none. The first pallor of morning was just beginning over the sea, and then in that undecided light, the islands appeared less like land than like thoughts becoming visible. "You are awake early," Sinbad said. "I am old," Ibrahim answered. "The night lets go of me in pieces." Sinbad sat beside him. For a while they watched the chain emerge. Then Ibrahim said, "Do you hear how the water sounds different on each side?" Sinbad listened more carefully. To starboard there was a soft, broad hush against reed edges. To port, a smaller tapping where ripples touched exposed shells on a low bar. Ahead, from some inner place not yet seen, came the faintest wooden knock, irregular and hollow. "A post," Sinbad said, "or the memory of one." When full morning came, they began the work of finding the old anchorage. It was slow work, and because it was slow, it felt right. Leith brought the evening gull only so far inward as prudence allowed, then anchored in a lane of clear enough depth between two reed islands, while the smaller boat was lowered. Ibrahim, Sinbad, Leith, Nabil, and Sabir went in the boat first, carrying sound line, staff, a small anchor stone, water, and the folded chart case wrapped against spray. The others watched from the ship, ready if called. The boat moved between reeds whose roots braided the water below them into darker seams. Small fish flashed away beneath the hull. Here and there, pale sand showed through in cloudy patches where the bottom rose. The air smelled different inside the chain, less of open salt, more of warm silt, reeds, sun on shell, and the faint sweetness of tamarisk. It was not unpleasant. It smelled like shallows with memory. The first island they stepped onto was narrow and resilient underfoot, a braid of reed roots and silt, capped with dry silver grass. The second was firmer, a proper strip of sand and shell with patches of salt grass and a higher center where tamarisk grew. There they found evidence that human use had not vanished completely. A mooring post, worn smooth and leaning but still rooted. 3 pottery shards of the sort used for lamp oil. A line of shell fragments arranged unnaturally, perhaps once the edge of a path or a drainage lip. And farther in, the broken frame of a wicker basket, large enough to have held cargo or lantern supplies. Sabir lifted one shard carefully. Then someone came here after the charts were old. Of course, Ibrahim said, places do not stop being used all at once. They thin. The word suited the islands, and from the Tamarisk Island they could see farther inward. There, nearly hidden behind a longer sand tongue, lay a sheltered sheet of water exactly where the old anchorage might once have been, though smaller now and approached differently. Along its outer lip stood 3 reed towers, or what remained of them. One leaned. One had fallen into a low sprawl. One still stood straight enough to cast a thin shadow. Beyond them, on a firmer central island, was a cluster of low foundations and one roof frame patched with newer reeds, as if someone, sometime within recent years, had slept there or used it seasonally. Laith shaded his eyes. A harbor of sorts. A resting place, Ibrahim corrected gently. They moved onward. The channels inward required frequent sounding and more than one revision of the old chart's assumptions. Once Nabil called a depth that should have been safe by the older brown line, only to find the sand rose sooner than expected. Another time, the blue-gray correction seemed too cautious, and a deeper path lay open beside a tamarisk bank where birds had been standing. Ibrahim noticed it not by the water alone, but by how the reeds leaned with the current. By noon they had reached the sheltered inner water. It was not a harbor in any city sense. No stone quay greeted them, no proper pier. Instead, the resting place consisted of a calm interior basin, no larger than a market square, ringed by low island shoulders, reed banks, and one firmer shelf of shell sand where boats could nose gently in at high enough tide. The water there was a little deeper, its surface holding stillness differently. One could imagine why traders had favored it. It was hidden from wider swell, softened by reeds, and intimately scaled. A vessel entering there would not feel commanded by the landscape. It would feel received. On the central island, the old settlement traces were clearer. There had once been perhaps 4 structures, all light-built. A storage hut, a lamp shelter, a resting room, and a little raised platform with drainage channels cut around it. Most had gone back to sand and weather. Yet one hut frame endured, patched in later years by someone whose work was plain and sensible. Inside, under a roof of reed matting weighted with driftwood, lay a rolled fishing net, a clay jar half full of shell lime, and a broom of palm fiber, surprisingly intact. There was also, in a wall niche, a small bundle wrapped in a blue cloth. Sinbad touched the bundle and found the cloth dry. On the inside were 3 narrow tablets of wax-coated cedar, protected by the cloth from salt air. One tablet had cracked. Another still held legible incisions beneath its aged wax. Ibrahim leaned close, and the light in his face changed. "Current notes," he whispered. They warmed the tablet slightly in the shade of the doorway and brushed away dust. The writing, though faint, was readable enough. Second moon after flood. Outer sand farther east. Move west lamp basket 2 poles inward. No fresh water at East Hollow. Use tamarisk well on Middle Island. Do not trust straight entry by evening light. Take reed line, then turn where the white shell bank begins. The hand was small, disciplined, and utterly practical. It felt to Sinbad like reaching across years and touching another patient mind. "Who wrote them?" he asked. Ibrahim traced one line without pressing the wax. "Perhaps Harun of the Reeds, perhaps his daughter, perhaps one of the later keepers. I knew them only by visits, not by their full household names." A place that had seemed at first abandoned now felt differently inhabited, not by many people and not recently in any constant way, but by attentiveness stored into objects, notes, posts, and repaired roofs. Dua's rest had once taught Sinbad that a harbor could sleep without bitterness. These drifting islands seemed to teach something gentler still, that even a moving place may preserve its memory if someone keeps writing down where it has gone. They spent that first full day not repairing anything yet, but understanding. Leith brought the evening gull inward as far as the outer lane, before deciding the inner basin should be left to smaller craft until they learned it better. Cargo remained safe aboard. The crew ferried supplies in the small boat. Water was taken from a shallow well on the middle island after Sabir and Sinbad dug carefully beside the tamarisk line, exactly where the old tablet instructed. The water there rose sweet enough, cool and faintly mineral under the sand. Hamad laughed with relief when he tasted it. Then these islands are not drifting away from mercy entirely. They found also the lantern remnants. Each reed tower had once held a basket or tray for a shielded oil light. The baskets themselves were mostly gone, but their ring brackets remained on 2 towers, and the ladder pegs on one were still usable if tested carefully. Near the fallen tower, they uncovered an old copper reflector plate, greened by salt, but whole beneath the tarnish. Inside the patched hut, behind a stack of shell lime jars, lay a bundle of vented horn panels wrapped in reed cloth. One had cracked. 2 were usable. The discovery quieted everyone. It meant the place had not been empty by accident. Someone had preserved what might one day be needed. Toward evening, when the work of looking had softened into the work of imagining, Sinbad took the blue cloth from around the tablets and held it up to the last light. It was not unlike the cloth he himself had bought in Basra. The weave was practical, close, unadorned, dyed a blue now faded toward sea gray. He thought then, without any clear reason, that some places call to their own restoration before a person knows he has answered. But that first night inside the chain was one of the quietest he had ever known. The evening gull rested in the outer lane, while Sinbad, Ibrahim, Leith, and Sabir slept on the central island under the patched roof, more out of practicality than romance, because they wanted the inner basin's dawn sounds close at hand. Hamad sent in a pot of rice and lentils. Lanterns were kept low. The air smelled of reeds, sand cooling after sun, old wood, and the faint sweetness of brackish shallows. Tiny wavelets touched the basin edge. Somewhere in the reeds, a bird moved, then stilled. Across the water, the standing tower held a dark silhouette against the rising moon. Sinbad lay awake for a long time listening, not because of unease, rather because the island seemed to be speaking in many small manners at once. Reeds brushing, water settling under roots, a loose ring on a mooring post touching wood. the patched roof taking the night air through its matting. The place felt not empty, but waiting for its proper gestures to begin again. In the morning, they climbed the standing tower. Laith refused at first to let Ibrahim do so, but the old man silenced him with a look that managed to be courteous and immovable. In the end, Sinbad went first, testing each peg. Ibrahim followed with grave steadiness, and Laith came behind as insurance rather than escort. At the top, the tray where a lantern once stood was gone, but the view justified the climb entirely. From above, the drifting nature of the chain became plain. The islands did not sit as separate beads on water. They lay in long, pale relations, some nearly joined, some pulling apart, and some braided by reed channels so narrow a bird could step them, others divided by deeper blue seams. One could see how last generation's charts had become wrong without ever becoming useless. The central basin still existed, but its safest approach had migrated westward. An older sand tongue had split, forming a bright false line to the east that would mislead a stranger by evening light. The outer reed island that once shielded the basin directly had thinned, and another farther south now carried more of that work. The harbor, if harbor it could still be called, had not disappeared. It had drifted in the sense that music drifts from one note into another and remains itself. Ibrahim stood beside the empty lantern tray and looked for a very long time before saying, "This is not a dead route. It is a route that was insulted by fixed minds." Laith, who was not given to grand phrases, merely said, "Then we will have to become less fixed." That was the beginning. The first necessary task, they all agreed, was not to build anything new, but to restore the language by which boats might read the islands again. Without that, cargo and goodwill alike would run aground in their own certainty. So the next days became days of marking, measuring, cleaning, copying, and learning the chain's present form. Sinbad and Nabil took soundings morning and evening, because the tide changed the temper of the channels. Sabir carried reed stakes cut from the taller island beds, and together they set temporary markers along the safer inward line. Ibrahim amended the chart with blue-gray ink from a traveling vial he carried in a padded tube. Laith selected which old posts could still serve and which should be allowed to lie down without argument. Hamad and Rashid from the ship patched the island hut roof further and cleaned the little drainage cuts around the raised platform, so goods might be laid there in future without damp creeping up from below. They found a second well, sweeter than the first, though more shallow, on a narrow island to the west where tamarisk roots held the sand firm. They found, too, the remains of a floating lantern raft, little more than decayed reed bundles and a copper ring, but enough to show that in later years, when towers no longer matched the moving channel exactly, someone had adapted by anchoring lights where the water now wanted them. "That," Ibrahim said, lifting the copper ring and letting it drip bright water back into the basin, "is wisdom. Not preserving the tower because it was there, but preserving the guidance because it was needed." The old man said very little more. He did not have to. Days passed so gently that time seemed to stretch like woven cloth drying in mild sea air. They worked. They ate. They watched the channels by different lights. They slept under patched roofs or aboard the evening gull in the outer lane when tide or comfort suggested it. Little by little, the island ceased to feel like a puzzle and became instead a set of relationships the body itself began to remember. The softer footing near the west well, the shell ridge that marked the turn toward the inner basin, the reed scent that deepened where fresh seep lay below, the color of the water at dusk when it was safe to enter and when it was merely beautiful. On the fourth evening of this patient labor, Sabir found something that altered the work again. He had been sent to clear drift from the base of the fallen reed tower when he called softly for Sinbad. Under a mat of old reed stems and shell fragments lay a flat board of weathered cedar, pegged at one end to what remained of a post. Its surface, once cleaned carefully with a damp cloth, showed not decoration but incised notches and small carved symbols, little lamp marks, tide crescents, bird feet, reed sprays, and arrows. A local guide board, Ibrahim said when he saw it. Each mark corresponded not to abstract measurements alone, but to things visible to island keepers across the seasons. When white birds mass at East Bar, shift outer marker west. When tamarisk shadow reaches shell spit at dusk, do not enter by south seam. And after flood month, check west well. There was even a small carved basket sign with 2 lines beneath it, perhaps meaning floating lantern. Sinbad ran one finger lightly above the carvings. He could almost feel the mind that had once made them. Practical, observant, uninterested in being impressive. Then the islands were always meant to be read anew, he said. They were, Ibrahim answered. And perhaps that is why men later called them lost. It is easier to say a place vanished than to admit one stopped reading. That evening, under a moon still shy of full, they lit the first restored lantern. It was not yet the full system. Nothing so ambitious had been attempted. But using the best horn panel, the salvage reflector, one of Sinbad's spare glass chimneys, copper mesh, and a small tray fitted to the standing tower, they made a modest, shielded light and lifted it into place at dusk. Sabir climbed with it under Lath's watchful eye. Sinbad steadied the lower ladder. Ibrahim stood below with his chart case closed at his feet, looking not up at the boy but outward toward the channel the light would serve. When the flame took and settled behind its shielding, the change in the basin was extraordinary, though gentle. The lantern did not make the islands bright. It made them readable. The standing tower, now carrying a warm amber light, marked the turn between outer false gleam and inner safety. The channel seemed to gather itself around that guidance. The shell ridge beyond reflected faintly. The water along the reed edge darkened into a trustworthy line. Even Lath, who had seen many harbor lamps in his life and praised few, gave a small breath of approval. There, he said, now the islands are speaking again. No ship entered that night. None was expected. Yet the single lamp burning over the shifting chain felt like a promise spoken aloud after years of being held only in memory. Sinbad stood a long time in the basin shallows, watching the light tremble on the water between reed shadows. Above him, The tower leaned slightly, but not dishonorably. Behind him, the patched hut glowed faintly from a cook lamp. Across the shallows, Tamarisk moved in the breeze with the smallest silver rustle. The islands, which men in easier harbors had said had drifted away, had not gone anywhere beyond the reach of patience. They had only continued becoming themselves. And with that first lantern burning above the moving water, the work ahead of reading, restoring, marking, and perhaps one day welcoming quiet traders back into that braided world of sand and reed, seemed not like the reopening of something dead, but like the resumption of a conversation, paused mid-sentence and taken up at last in the same soft tone. That night they left the lantern burning longer than strict necessity required, partly because the channel was new again beneath their eyes, and partly because no one wished to hurry the islands back into darkness after so patient a return. The light stood on its leaning tower with a modest steadiness, not high enough to command the whole chain, yet sufficient to gather one narrow thread of water out of many and lay a warm, speaking line across it. Around the central basin, the low islands seemed to listen. Reeds moved in soft silver plains under the moon. Shell ridges took pale brightness and gave it back into broken strips. Here and there the darker channels held the sky more deeply than the open sea beyond, as if the water among the islands had become a different element altogether. Less a road, a more woven interior world in which light had to learn the curves before it could travel with grace. Sinbad sat at the edge of the raised platform outside the patched hut, his feet on the packed shell sand below, and watched the lantern's reflection lengthen and shorten whenever the tide shifted through the inner cuts. Behind him, Hamad's little cook fire had settled into embers. A lidded pot still breathed out the fragrance of rice, lentils, onion, and the touch of cumin he used even on the plainest meals. Sabir had fallen asleep, rolled in a wool cloak against the inner wall, one hand still loosely curved as if around an invisible rope. Laith sat farther off near the boat landing, elbows on his knees, watching not the light itself, but the effect it had on the channel. Ibrahim remained upright beneath the tower, his staff across both palms, his face lifted toward the little tray as though reading some old and familiar script written in flame. Now and then, a bird shifted in the reeds. Once, far out toward the outer bars, some unseen fish made a small, round disturbance and was gone. Nothing else asked to be noticed. The islands did not need spectacle. Their gentleness lay precisely in how much they continued without requiring anyone to call it wondrous. After a long while, Ibrahim came and sat beside Sinbad. The old man lowered himself carefully, with the practiced economy of someone who no longer wasted movement on pride, and for a few breaths he said nothing. He smelled faintly of wool, warmed by the day, lamp oil, and the papery dryness of old charts. At length he said, "When I was younger, I thought every useful place should be given stone if stone could be afforded." Sinbad turned his head slightly but did not interrupt. Ibrahim looked toward the dim outline of the outer reed islands. "Stone seems honorable to young men. It appears to promise duration. It makes people feel they have triumphed over weather, merely by setting blocks where weather must pass. But there are places in the world where stone is not wisdom, only insistence. He lifted one hand and let it settle again on the staff. Here, what endures is not the tower, it is the relation, the turn by the shell bank, the line of reeds that catches the evening breeze first, the tamarisk above the sweet seep, the little basin's refusal to silt entirely shut. If the island shifts, and the keeper does not shift with it, the keeper becomes the one who is lost. Sinbad let the thought rest in him, like a boat easing into a known berth. Then the harbor was abandoned by men who trusted fixed things more than living ones. Yes, Ibrahim said, and by men who preferred to call their own stiffness practicality. That was all he said for some time after, and it was enough. The lantern burned on. The tide turned almost imperceptibly. Somewhere in the dark, the outer bars gave a long, soft sigh as water thinned across them. Before sleeping, Sinbad walked once to the standing tower and put his hand to the old post beneath the lantern tray. It was reed bound to wood braced to a patch of firmer shell sand, and yet under his palm it felt less fragile than many fine harbor columns he had seen in greater ports. Those greater columns, if neglected, which became mere stone. This tower, though lean and patched, felt still in conversation with the place that held it. He slept lightly, as people do in new anchorage or on old ground newly remembered, and woke before dawn to a world gone almost colorless, with first light. The islands lay in layers of pearl and blue-gray. Mist held low over the shallow cuts. The lantern above him had dimmed, but still breathed a little warmth in its tray. Laith was already awake and standing at the basin edge, looking westward along the outer islands, where a few white birds had begun to move. By full morning, the day's work presented itself clearly. The single restored lantern had proved its honesty, but one light alone could not teach strangers the living grammar of the chain. The older notes, the tower positions, the floating lantern ring, and the changed channels all suggested that the old route had once been spoken by several modest markers working together, each one related not to permanence, but to current truth. If they meant the rest of lanterns to breathe again, they would need more than one tray of flame. They would need a system able to move. So after bread, olives, and water from the west well, they began by walking the islands rather than building upon them. Laith said, "A man who repairs before he understands is only hiding his confusion under fresh rope." No one contradicted him. They crossed first to the long, pale bar east of the basin, where the shells lay thick and broken, and the birds stood in the manner the old carved guideboard had mentioned. In the hard morning light, the bar seemed almost inviting as an entry line. Water on its outer side shone broad and smooth. Yet Nabil, sounding beside the boat, found it shoaled too suddenly. Ibrahim nodded at the sounding without pleasure or surprise. Evening light would flatter that route, he said. It would look forgiving until the last little while. Then this bar misleads, Sinbad said. It does its nature, Ibrahim answered. Men mislead themselves when they ask brightness to prove depth. From there they moved to the western reed island, which had seemed at dusk merely a silver line. but in morning showed itself broader and more stable than expected. Reeds grew high there, and beneath them the soil had thickened enough with years of silt to support not only tamarisk, but a few low salt-resistant shrubs. At the south tip, they found remains of another platform, lower than the standing tower and never meant for a heavy lantern. Only 3 post sockets and a ring of shell-lime rubble remained. Yet from that point, the inward turn toward the basin became clear. "A basket light here," Lath said softly, almost to himself. "Not for entering the whole chain, only for confirming the west turn once the boat is already committed." Ibrahim inclined his head. "You see the old thinking, only because the water explains it." They marked the place with a reed stake wrapped in blue cloth, the same sturdy cloth Sinbad had bought in Basra and not yet used. Against the silver reeds it showed enough to guide an eye by day without shouting. By noon they had identified 3 points that could form the beginnings of a renewed system. The standing tower at the basin side, the low western basket platform for the inward turn, and a floating marker or raft near the outer false brightness to warn a careful captain away from the tempting but shallow east approach. The last would be the most delicate, because anything floating among such channels must be trustworthy without pretending to be still. That, too, seemed perfectly suited to the island's character. Back at the hut, Hamad and Rashid had cleared more of the platform and laid the rolled reed mats to dry in the sun. Sabir had cleaned one of the salvaged horn panels until it glowed milky and warm. On the packed floor inside the hut, Sinbad spread a fresh sheet of paper and began, under Ibrahim's dictation and his own growing understanding, a current ledger for the islands. He wrote, "Rest of lanterns. Present season. The standing tower remains sound enough for modest flame and fair weather, if checked at dawn and dusk. Western basket point above Reed Island still useful. Requires low tray only, with shield, and no excess height. Outer false brightness east of basin. Dangerous in evening light. A floating lantern or marked post to be placed westward of the white shell gleam, not in the gleam itself." The old man watched him write, and then said, "Leave a space between each truth. Crowded advice becomes prideful." Sinbad smiled and left a broad space between lines. It was later that same afternoon, when the sun had begun to soften, and the reeds took on a clearer silver, that the first visitor arrived. It was not a trader from any far port, nor even a captain who had heard new rumor and come seeking profit. It was a low marsh skiff with a woven awning no larger than a sleeping mat and a double-bladed paddle laid across the stern. The skiff emerged from behind a reed bank so quietly that Sabir, though he had been sent to watch the outer channel from the tower, almost believed it had grown directly from the islands. The person steering it was a woman perhaps in her late 40s, though the marsh sun and brine had written their own years upon her face. She wore a dark green headcloth and a plain wool outer wrap, bleached pale in places by salt and weather. Her expression was not startled at seeing people in the basin. It was measuring. Beside her sat a boy of 10 or 11, with a basket of reed bundles at his feet, and an old bronze kettle tucked under one arm. Lath, who was mending a small hook near the hut, rose but did not call out, and the woman guided the skiff toward the shore shelf below the standing tower, let it touch, and stepped lightly into the shallows. "So someone lit it again," she said. Her voice carried no surprise greater than the tide itself might carry. It was low and matter-of-fact, like a person accustomed to speaking only enough words to bring a boat alongside or a net ashore. Ibrahim, who had come forward more slowly, studied her face for a breath or two, and then said, "Samira bint Harun." The woman's eyes sharpened. "And Ibrahim of the slow charts, unless age has made me rude to someone else." "Not yet." A very faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. It altered the whole weather of her face, and then was gone. Samira, as it proved, was the granddaughter of the keeper whose current notes were likely on the wax tablets. In childhood, she had spent flood seasons between these islands and a marsh settlement farther inland, where her people cut reeds, gathered salt grass, traded rope fiber, and fished the channels. Later, when the route thinned and fewer traders came, her family had abandoned any permanent keeping of the basin, yet they had not forgotten it. She still crossed the chain in certain seasons to cut the best reed for weaving lampshades and basket linings. She had seen the lantern burning the previous night from the marsh edge and had come at first light, though the winding channels had delayed her approach. "You should have come sooner," Ibrahim said. She lifted one shoulder. "You should have stayed younger." Laith gave a quiet breath through his nose. That might have been approval. Samira looked past them then, taking in the renewed tray, the cleaned hut, the rolled papers, the marked West Point, and the strangers who had not yet put foolish structures where reeds needed room. "You came to fix it," she said. "To read it first," Sinbad answered. For the first time her gaze rested on him. It was a practical gaze, not unkind, only unadorned. "Good," she said. "Men who come to fix islands usually mean to nail them still." The boy beside her, whose name was Eunice, carried the basket ashore. Inside were fine reed strips, a little bundle of fish dried flat in salt, and 3 shallow woven lantern shades of the sort used in marsh boats to soften wind around a flame. Samira offered the shades without ceremony. "These work better on moving water than rigid housings," she said. "If you intend a floating light again, use these around the glass." Sinbad turned one in his hands. The weave was exact, close enough to temper wind, open enough not to choke the flame. A practical beauty lived in it, the kind that never asks to be admired, and therefore often deserves it most. From that day the work changed, not in urgency, for nothing here wished to be hurried, but in intimacy. Ibrahim had brought charts and memory. Laith had brought seamanship and restraint. Samira brought the island's present body. She knew where the best reed for strong bindings grew, now that the old southern bed had migrated. She knew which channels held coolness, longest in noon heat, which meant depth enough for a boat, and which only pretended to. She knew where the tamarisk cast useful shadow on the west well, and where birds settled before weather changes. She knew, too, the practical discouragements that had thinned the route. Men from bigger ports came with fixed posts, she said one evening while shaving reed lengths with a little knife. They drove them deep where the old path had been and wrote fresh instructions on clean boards. One flood season later, the channel moved, the posts leaned wrong, and the boards became lies. After that, they said the islands could not be trusted. The islands had not lied, Ibrahim said. No, Samira replied. Only the boards. Those quiet sentences shaped everything that followed. With Samira's help, they built not a rigid restoration, but a moving one. The outer warning light became a float of bound reed bundles, and light cedar slats lashed around the salvaged copper ring they had found. Nabil balanced it by trial in the basin first, adding shell-filled weights beneath and buoyant reed rolls above, until it rode low enough to remain stable, yet high enough to show its little shielded flame. Over the glass, Sinbad fitted one of Samira's woven shades. When set in the outer westward seam away from the false brightness, it did not pretend to be land. It admitted itself a waterborne guide, and therefore seemed all the more truthful. The west basket platform they raised only to knee-height above the reed island, using fresh-cut reed, cedar pegs, and a shallow tray lined with copper mesh. Its light would be small, meant only to confirm the inward turn once a boat had ignored the deceptive east gleam. Sabir loved this piece of work best because it required careful hands more than strength. He sat with Samira learning to weave wind baffles from reed splits so fine it almost resembled straw. Under her instruction, his fingers grew slower and better. The standing tower received the most visible attention. The post was checked from base to tray, the ladder pegs replaced where rot had set in, and a little rain lip woven from reed and tarred cloth to protect the tray from sudden showers. Ibrahim found among the hut stores an old shell lime jar packed with bronze nails wrapped in oilcloth. Some had greened, but many were usable. Someone expected return, he said quietly, holding up the packet. By the next new moon, 3 modest lights spoke across the islands. At dusk, the outer float glimmered first, low on the darkening water, not as a welcome, but as a refusal of the wrong line. The west basket light answered from its reed bank, small and warm. Then the standing tower lit above the basin, steady and sufficient. No grand harbor in Basra or Saraf would have counted such things impressive. Yet to the evening gull, which Laith twice guided inward by them after standing off deliberately in fading light to test the system, they spoke clearly, kindly, and without boast. That was more than impression. It was grace. The first trader to use the renewed resting place came not in excitement, but in ordinary need. He was a salt carrier from the marsh edge with a shallow draft craft, heavy only in appearance because the salt cakes were packed broad rather than high. He had heard from a fisherman that a light stood again among the drifting chain. At dusk he waited outside until Laith himself stood in the skiff and signaled the line. The outer float showed him what not to trust. The west basket light drew him inward. The standing tower gathered the final approach. When he reached the basin and laid his little craft against the shell shelf, he stepped ashore and looked at the 3 lights for a long time. "I thought I had remembered this place wrongly," he said at last. Samira, tying off his line, answered, "Perhaps you remembered it before others stopped trying." He traded 2 cakes of good salt and a jar of pickled herbs for fresh water, lamp wick, and the right to sleep one night without moving on. In the morning, he left 3 sturdy poles cut from marshwood against future need. No ceremony attended the exchange. That made it sweeter. Thereafter, other small arrivals followed in the old, true way. Not as a sudden flood of commerce, but as a resumption of use. A fisher pair from the South Channels brought smoked mullet and asked after water. A paper skiff with only 2 men aboard rested one cool evening in the basin and left behind a packet of rough reed paper when they heard Sinbad was keeping a new current ledger. A woman carrying dyed rope fiber and woven fish traps exchanged them for ceramic jars. A narrow cloth boat from the North Islands entered under a low moon, took shelter, and spent the night with every voice lowered as if the basin itself asked it. With each arrival, the ledger grew. Sinbad recorded depth notes, cargo habits, weather observations, and the slight shifts that mattered here more than in fixed ports. He did not merely note that a vessel came. He noted how it entered. Which channel line read most clearly under thin cloud? Whether the outer float sat true after a change of current. How the west basket flame behaved in crosswind. Whether the shell shelf took 2 boats at once without crowding their hulls into the reeds. Such attentions were not clerical alone. They were the work itself. Ibrahim, seated beside him some afternoons in the hut shade, would sometimes add no more than 1 sentence. Write also that silence after the second watch helps one hear the tide against the reed roots. That tells more than a shouted sounding. Or, leave room under today's date. The islands may answer tomorrow. So he did. One afternoon, after several mild days and 1 softer rain that darkened the shell ridges and filled the reed scents with sweetness, Samira took Sinbad farther than the others had yet gone, beyond the west well and out to a low island that seemed at first nothing more than a pale shoulder of sand with 3 bent shrubs. She brought no chart. She did not need one. At the northern edge of this island, she crouched and brushed away a little dry drift. Beneath lay a line of shell fragments carefully arranged in a curve. Lamp path, she said. For what? For walking in night fog from the old sleeping hut to the west basket point. The keepers laid shell white side up. In mist, it showed under a hand lamp when the reeds themselves disappeared. Sinbad knelt beside the line. The shells were small, many broken, but their arrangement was unmistakably intentional. He felt then with unusual force how much labor had once gone into keeping such a place legible. Not grand labor. Not labor any city official would boast of in a proclamation, but the intimate recurring labor of people who knew that safe passage often depends on a path of shells underfoot, on a basket of oil hung high enough, on a note about birds and flood months, on a change stake moved half a boat length west. Why did your family stop coming? He asked gently. Samira's fingers rested on the shells. My mother fell ill one flood season. My brothers took work near Stone Keys where wages were regular. Traders wanted still jetties and written fees, not lanterns moved with reeds. The islands were called tiresome. After that, to come here was to keep a place alive, mostly for memory. And memory does not always fill a cooking pot. She said it without bitterness. the statement lay between them, like something weathered smooth. After a while she added, "But some places are poorer for being forgotten than for being poor." That evening, Sinbad wrote the sentence in the back of his ledger, not under any date, but among the small truths he wished to keep. The season lengthened. Then, almost imperceptibly, it began to tilt towards softness. Days grew a little less white at noon. The evening breeze came sooner and with a cooler edge. The reeds whispered more dryly near the tips. The marsh birds changed. New flocks stopped briefly on outer bars. The basin's night water darkened earlier and held the lantern reflections with greater depth. One could feel the islands continuing their slow, inward conversations under the surface, though no single shift yet demanded action. Then one morning the shift came. It was not a storm. No dramatic weather preceded it. Rather, after 3 tides of a particular pull and one steady night wind from the southeast, the outer false brightness bar altered just enough to matter. Nabil found it first while sounding from the skiff. Water that had yesterday held a boat's draft safely beside the float now shoaled earlier. The shell gleam had extended. The dark seam west of it had moved perhaps only the length of 2 oars, but that was enough. Laith did not curse the sea for being itself. He merely said, "Then we move with it." So the whole harbor system performed its first deliberate adaptation. The outer float was brought in at midday, its reed bundles checked, weights shifted and mooring line shortened. Samira stood on the bar in rolled garments, knee-deep in clear water, placing a fresh stake, while Sinbad and Sabir held the float steady from the skiff. Ibrahim, from the standing tower, watched the relation of float to west basket and called softly when it sat right. Then they withdrew and waited until evening light to test the line again. When the dusk came, the new relation proved truer than the old by a calm and visible margin. The float now denied the false gleam exactly. The basket light caught the eye at the proper turn. The standing tower gathered the final inward dark. Laith, who took the skiff out alone and then brought it back under the lights as if he were a stranger to the route, nodded only once when he stepped ashore. "This is how it must always be kept," he said. "Yes," said Sinbad, "not fixed, then, but faithful." That lesson entered him more deeply than any chart symbol. In larger ports, keeping order often means preserving form. Here it meant preserving relationship, a line on paper, a lantern on a float, a stake moved by 2 oars, a shell path refreshed, everything humble, everything alive. It seemed to him that perhaps many human griefs came from confusing permanence with truth, when often the truer thing is the one that knows how to drift a little, and yet remain in honorable relation to all else around it. He did not say this aloud. He simply kept working. By the time a full moon rose broad and pale over the chain, the rest of lanterns had become once more what its older name implied, not a fixed harbor, but a resting place spoken by lights. The basin was used perhaps twice each week by some modest craft. Water jars passed, cloth, salt, fish, paper, rope, and lamp oil moved through in quantities small enough not to bruise the island's balance. The hut floor remained swept of the wells were covered when not in use. A second sleeping shelter was mended on the West Island for those carrying lanterns in mist or making late arrivals. Samira's shell path was renewed in 3 places. Sabir copied the carved guideboard marks onto paper with surprising neatness. Hamad, who had first treated the stay as an interesting delay in commerce, now brewed tea each dusk on the central platform as if the basin itself had earned hospitality. One moonlit night, when the basin held only the evening gull and a small rope fiber boat from the marshes, Ibrahim asked Sinbad to come with him to the outer reed island, beyond the west basket light. They took the skiff in silence. The moon laid long, pale seams over the channels. Reeds breathed against one another in the small, dry whisper they make when night wind leans through them. Behind, the 3 lights held their modest order. Low outer glimmer, inland basket flame, standing tower above the basin. No sound of trade carried, only water, reeds, and the little knock of the skiff's bow against the drifting stems. On the island, Ibrahim did not sit at once. He walked with his staff to the northern edge, where the shell ridge fell gently into shallows, and stood there looking back over the chain. For some time he said nothing at all. Sinbad stood nearby, giving the old man the courtesy of unfilled silence. At last Ibrahim said, "There is something else I have not told you." The words were familiar in shape to confessions shared in other harbors, and yet this one came not with weighty sorrow, but with the calmness of an old knot finally made visible before being untied. "In my middle years," Ibrahim said, "when merchants began complaining that these islands cost them time, I was asked more than once to make a definitive chart. Something fixed, saleable, stable for 20 years. They wanted a document that would excuse them from needing keepers who knew the reeds and birds. I told them, in careful language, that the chain was best served by seasonal notes and flexible markers. They did not like that answer. So later, under pressure and with too much regard for convenience, I made a chart cleaner than truth." He let the words settle over the shell ridge. "It was not entirely false," he continued. "That is the worst kind of error. It showed the islands as if they would hold one arrangement long enough to build trade habits upon. It omitted the need for floating lights. It fixed what should have been described as moving. The chart sold well for some years. Then captains used it too confidently. A few grounded lightly. Others avoided the route altogether. People began saying the chain had become unreliable. In truth, I had made it appear more reliable in the wrong way." Moonlight touched the old man's profile and the white of his beard. His face carried neither self-pity nor theatrical regret, only plain recognition. Sinbad looked out across the water where the outer float trembled very slightly in its mooring. "And so you came back?" "Yes, to amend your own neatness." A breath that might have been laughter passed through Ibrahim's nose. "That is one way to name it." They stood there together while the tide slipped in around the shell edge. At last Sinbad said, "The chart failed because it forgot to be humble." Ibrahim nodded once. So did I. It was perhaps the deepest kinship between them, that neither man wished to dramatize failure, yet neither wished to leave it unnamed. The islands had no use for self-reproach as performance. They preferred correction in the form of better work. When they rowed back, the three lights still held their line. Sabir was asleep in the hut doorway, wrapped in his cloak. Samira sat mending a reed shade by the standing tower. Laith had gone aboard the Evening Gull and left only a small stern lamp. The basin looked exactly as it had when they departed, yet to Sinbad the whole place felt more fully understood. Not because its channels had become simple, but because the right complexity had been admitted. The next days gathered into a pattern so peaceful that the work itself became almost liturgical. At dawn, extinguish, clean, inspect, sound. By mid-morning, note the channels, mend what the night wind troubled, draw water, dry cloth, copy observations. At noon, eat in shade, rest if the heat asked it, never pressing the islands beyond their hour. By afternoon, repair, weave, cut reed, move stakes where tide advised, receive modest visitors if any came. At dusk, light the three guides in their order, then lower all voices as the basin settled. At night, listen, watch, let the islands teach by the way sound moved among them. With repetition came affection. Sabir began naming the little shifts in current under his breath, not to claim them, but to remember them. Nabil trusted Samira's reed signs as much as he trusted soundings. Hamad began hanging fish strips to dry in precisely the place on the west side where the evening breeze passed cleanest and least damp. Rashid mended a basket platform and then, without being asked, refreshed the shell path to the west light, because he had once almost missed the turn in moon mist and did not wish anyone else to. Laith, who could have argued that a captain's profit lay elsewhere, instead spoke quietly of bringing future cargoes fit for such a resting place. Never too much, always what the islands could take without losing themselves. Then, one day, a boy arrived from the marsh settlements, carrying a rolled mat tube, sealed with wax. Inside was a letter for Samira, from her older brother, written by a scribe because the brother's own hand was poor, but his wishes practical. He had heard that the lights now stood again. He had heard also that traders used the basin honestly, and that no one was driving fixed posts into false certainty. If this remained true through another moon, he would send 2 nephews for part of the cool season to help with reed cutting, repairs, and water hauling, so that the work might belong again to a household rather than to passing goodwill alone. Samira read the letter twice and then handed it to Sinbad with an expression that remained composed yet gentler than usual. "That," she said, "is the first real return." It was. More than trade, more than repaired trays. A place revives when people begin imagining their family labor belonging to it again. The nephews came, and with them came another layer of continuity. One was quiet and broad-handed, the other younger, quick-eyed, curious about lantern glass and chart symbols. They brought bundles of fresh reed, a sack of marsh onions, 2 jars of thick oil, and stories of how the lights looked from certain inland channels on a clear night. Under Samira's direction and Ibrahim's occasional correction, they learned the shell paths, the wells, the sounding lines, the ledger headings, and the order of lighting. Sabir, who had first been the youngest learner, now taught what he himself had only recently learned, and did so with a gravity that made Sinbad smile in secret. By the turn of the next moon, the rest of lanterns no longer felt like an experiment. It felt like a small living root. It remained delicate. The islands would always be delicate, but delicate things can be durable when held correctly. The basin received 3 or 4 craft each week at most. Salt, fish, blown cloth, reed paper, lamp oil, shell lime, herbs, and rope fiber passed through. One careful ceramic merchant began leaving a few broad jars each month because he valued the water and quiet rest there. A scribe on a paper boat copied part of Sinbad's channel notes in exchange for dried fish and promised to pass the information only to captains who knew how to keep their voices low in reed country. This pleased Leith greatly. Useful places should not be advertised to the wrong appetite. As the cool season deepened, the evenings became the harbor's most beautiful hour. The outer float, low and warm on black water, seemed at dusk like a thought one must not miss. The west basket light hovered among the reeds as if woven from reed shadow itself. The standing tower shone over the basin with sufficient steadiness to make the whole chain gather inward around it. And above these human lights, the moon moved in her own calm relation, laying silver on the shell bars and dark silk between them. Under such a sky, even the smallest boat entering quietly seemed part of a much older, slower choreography. Sinbad often stood by the basin edge then with his ledger closed in one hand and no wish to write. Some moments were complete enough without ink. It was on such an evening that Leith came to stand beside him and said without preface, "You cannot stay forever." The statement was not rebuke. It was sea truth. "No," Sinbad said, "the place must not learn dependence on one merchant's conscience." "No." Leith looked across the water where Samira's nephews were tending the west basket flame with Sabir. "It is nearly there. Another little while, perhaps until the first warmer winds. And then you must carry its existence outward in the right way and return only as one thread among several." Sinbad knew he was right. A harbor held together by one person alone is not yet restored. It is only being lovingly delayed from loss. Dua's rest had taught him that. The drifting islands taught it more quietly, but perhaps more deeply. The route must live in charts, in families, in small trade habits, in repeated use, in adjusted lights, in remembered shell paths, not in him alone. So he began gently, preparing for departure, even while remaining fully present. He made 3 fair copies of the current notes, one for Samira's household, one to travel with Leith and trusted captains, and one for himself to keep in Basra among the slower charts. He commissioned from Rashid a cedar box lined with wool and waxed cloth to protect the wax tablets, and the carved guideboard copy from damp travel, should copying ever be needed elsewhere. He and Ibrahim worked together to draft not a fixed chart, but a chart framed by instruction. This chain moves. Compare bird lines, reed beds, shell bars, and evening light. Never trust last season without fresh sounding. Floating markers are part of the truth, not signs of failure. Ibrahim smiled faintly when that last line was written. At last, he said, a chart honest enough to be inconvenienced. That winter was mild, and so their leave-taking did not have to be hurried by worsening weather. It came instead with the same patient inevitability that had shaped every better thing in the islands. Ibrahim, who had grown more tired but not weaker in spirit, decided at last to return north with Laith on the first suitable passage. He would not stay to another warm season. His hands shook slightly now when holding the astrolabe too long, though his eyes remained clear. Samira's household had re-entered the work. Sinbad's notes were in order. The lights spoke. The chain no longer needed his body as much as it had needed his return. On his final week there, the old man climbed once more to the standing tower. Sinbad went with him, though more from companionship than necessity. The day was clear. The outer bar shone pale as bone. The inner channels held their darker blue-green. Beyond, the sea rested broad and calm under a sky brushed with high white. At the top, Ibrahim laid one hand on the lantern tray and looked over the chain without speaking for a very long time. At last he said, "Do not let anyone call these islands unreliable again. I will not. Not because they are fixed. No, because they keep their promises differently." Sinbad turned the words over in his mind. They seemed to contain the whole voyage. Later that evening, after the lights were lit, and the basin had accepted another quiet night, Samira brought out from her hut a wrapped object and set it in Sinbad's hands. It was a small currant board freshly carved from smooth drift cedar. Along one edge she had cut the symbols in the old manner: bird feet, reed sprays, tide crescents, a little lamp tray, the mark for the west well, the shell path curve. For when your paper argues with weather, she said. He ran his thumb over the incisions. They were simple, exact, and alive, under the hand in a way ink could never fully match. I will keep it dry. Better, she said, keep it consulted. That was perhaps the most affectionate thing she ever said to him. When the day of departure came, it came under a dawn so pale it seemed the islands themselves had exhaled it. The evening gull rode quiet in the outer lane, cargo modestly gathered. There was fish aboard, lampshade reed, rope fiber, shell lime, and letters wrapped in waxed cloth for Basra and 2 southern captains. Nothing excessive. The basin lights had been extinguished at first gray. The shell ridges still held a little moonlight in their whiteness. Reeds stood damp and silver. The wells were covered. The hut floor was swept. A new boy from Samira's family, not yet old enough for ladder duty, slept rolled in matting near the shell path, as if he had always belonged there. Ibrahim stood by the basin edge with his chart case at his feet. Laith waited in the skiff without urging anyone. Samira held one hand on Eunice's shoulder. Sabir, who was going northward again with the evening gull, tried very hard to look only useful and not at all sorrowful. Sinbad walked once more to each light in turn before boarding. He checked the outer float line and the woven shade Samira had made. He touched the west basket frame and saw that the shell path remained bright enough under dawn. He climbed the standing tower and rested his hand where the lantern tray would warm again that evening. Below him, the islands lay in their loose, silver conversation. Not still, never still, yet more legible to him now than many stone coasts. He could see where one bar had thinned since the last moon, where reeds had thickened along the north seam, where the basin held its calm interior truth. The whole chain seemed less like a place to be mastered than a sentence one could spend years learning to read, without ever reaching its end. When he descended, Ibrahim was ready to go. The voyage northward did not feel like loss. That was the strange and comforting thing. The islands did not cling. They had taught too much about drift and relation for that. As the skiff carried them outward, Sinbad looked back and saw the standing tower, the reed platform, the low huts, the shell shelf, the tamarisk line, and the floating marker all diminish into one another. And then even these forms softened, and the chain became once more what it must have always seemed to strangers. Pale bars, dark seams, birds, reeds, and water. Yet he knew now that within that soft and changing pattern lived a root, a household labor, a resting place, and 3 quiet lights ready for dusk. The evening gull moved north under mild wind. Behind them, the drifting islands slowly unmade themselves in distance, not vanishing, but changing scale until only memory could hold their truest relation. Sinbad stood long at the stern. Sabir came beside him after a while, carrying a coil of line, mostly for the comfort of holding something known. "Will they move again before warm season?" the boy asked. "Yes." "Will that ruin all the notes?" "No." Sinbad smiled softly. "It will give them more to say." Sabir considered this and seemed satisfied. The coast widened, the birds thinned, open water gathered itself around the vessel. Yet even once the islands were fully lost to sight, Sinbad felt no severing. He carried their lesson, not as a sharp memory, but as a manner of seeing. In later years, when others would speak too easily of lost routes, vanished harbors, failing villages, or ways of life that had supposedly gone beyond recall, he would remember the drifting chain and ask first whether the place had truly vanished, or whether it had only ceased to flatter fixed minds. And many times after, in whatever harbor he found himself, if he saw a keeper move a lamp a little west, because a sand tongue had shifted, or a fisher family remark a channel after flood, or a merchant speak with patience of a place that had become difficult but not dead, he would feel again the cool dawn over shell bars and reeds, the warm little lights of the basin, Ibrahim's dry voice, Samira's practical hands, and the floating lantern telling boats not where permanence lay, but where the living truth of the water currently wanted them to pass. By the time the evening gull re-entered Basra's wider world of masts, tariffs, stairs, shouting porters, and warehouse ink, Sinbad had already begun thinking differently. He still kept accounts. He still bargained. He still valued sound hulls, careful captains, dry paper, clean jars, and honest profit. But now, when routes were discussed in counting rooms, he listened for another thing beneath the usual talk of speed and volume. He listened for whether a place was being described according to what it currently needed, or according to someone's wish that it would stop changing long enough to be convenient. That distinction changed more in him than any violent storm could have done. In the months that followed, he arranged the island's support without burdening them. Not many captains were told, only the right sort. Oil was sent in moderate measure. Paper, cloth, bronze pins, reed knives, wax, and good small tools traveled by trustworthy hands. The chart copies circulated carefully, each with instructions that no captain should rely on the page alone without asking after the latest shell bars and reed lines. Some laughed at such caution and were not invited. Others understood at once, and those were the ones whose boats later rested in the basin without bruising it. A year passed, then another season turned. Sinbad returned more than once, never with entourage, never with ambition grander than upkeep and listening. Sometimes the west light had moved. Sometimes the shell path had lengthened. Sometimes the basin received more cloth boats than fish boats. Once the outer float was set a full boat length south of where he had last seen it, and Samira merely said, "The birds told us early this year." Another time, the standing tower had been rebuilt slightly farther inland on firmer ground. The old post left where it stood to rot with dignity among the reeds. These changes no longer surprised him. They reassured him. The route was alive. Ibrahim did not return many times after that first great restoration. Age asked other things of him, but once, years later, when Sinbad visited him in Basra, the old man took from a cedar drawer a folded page of notes carried north by Laith, and read them with quiet contentment. Then he said, "Good. The islands are still disagreeing with certainty." It was one of the last times Sinbad heard him laugh, and always, in memory, the tale rested not in any one moment of finding, but in the soft continuance that followed. The first lantern on the leaning tower, the outer float drifting exactly where truth required, the shell path bright under mist, Samira's hands weaving a wind shade, Sabir learning to read channel color, Laith testing the line at dusk with a captain's honest caution, the west well-yielding sweet water under tamarisk roots, the carved board teaching that birds and reeds are part of navigation, the old man confessing that a neat chart can be less truthful than a humble one, the islands themselves neither lost nor held still, only continuing their long, patient drift within the embrace of tide, reed, sand, and light. So when later people would speak in his hearing of islands that drifted away, Sinbad would never quite accept the phrase as sorrow. He knew better. Some things do not drift away from us. They drift into forms that require more patience, more humility, and a kinder kind of attention. If we fail to follow, that is not always their vanishing. Sometimes it is merely our own refusal to move gently enough to remain in relation. And on certain quiet nights, especially when he happened to be aboard a small vessel entering some modest anchorage at dusk, and saw ahead not grand towers, but only a few careful lights, one low, one farther inward, one perhaps on moving water where the channel had changed. He would feel the old softness come into him again. He would smell reeds and shell sand even if none were near. He would hear the hush of water between islands that never quite held the same shape twice. And in that hush, he would remember how the drifting chain had taught him one of the sea's tenderest truths. that faithfulness is not always staying where one was placed. Sometimes faithfulness is moving quietly and continuously, while keeping one's relation to all that matters so honest that others may still find their way by the light one tends. By the time the warmer winds began to return in long, soft breaths from the south, Sinbad had fallen into the habit of listening for the drifting islands, even while he was far from them. He would be standing in Basra, at some ordinary riverside quay, waiting while a crate of glazed bowls was lowered by rope and padded cloth, and all at once his ear would catch a slight difference in the water under the pilings. Then, for a little moment, the broad river would seem to narrow inward into reed channels and shell bars, and the memory of the rest of lanterns would move through him like a tide returning beneath the skin. He would be in a storeroom counting lamp oil jars, and the smell of clean brass and wick would draw before him the low outer float glimmering over darkening water. He would unroll an account sheet, deflatten its corners with his palm, and think of Ibrahim's careful voice, warning him never to let paper pretend that movement was failure. These thoughts did not trouble his ordinary work. They steadied it. Basra remained Basra, generous in labor and unashamed of noise. The warehouses opened, the porters shouted, the ferries crossed, the scribes counted. The river swelled and lowered by familiar moons. Sinbad still bargained for cloth and spice, still chose captains by the temperament of their decks, still kept practical watch over moisture in paper, cracks in jars, and looseness in crate lashings. Yet behind the bustle of those days, another quieter ledger had begun keeping itself in him. Not a ledger of coin alone, nor even of useful roots, but of places that required a certain kind of patience in order to remain human. And that ledger brought him one late afternoon to Ibrahim's room above the map copying shop, where the old navigator sat by the lattice, with a bowl of mint tea cooling beside his elbow, and a loose sheaf of papers spread across his knees. The room was just as Sinbad remembered it. Cedar wrappers for charts stacked carefully against the wall, the brass astrolabe hanging from its peg, a shallow sand tray upon the floor, a little dish of shells by the lamp, and the softened smell of paper, wax, linen, and old wood. Only Ibrahim himself had altered further. The hands were still neat, but thinner. The face had gone finer in its bones. His beard, once white with a trace of steel, was now all winter. Yet his eyes remained precise and quietly wakeful. And when Sinbad entered, they brightened in that restrained way old eyes do, when gladness has long ago learned economy. "You walk as if you are still partly in reeds," Ibrahim said. Sinbad smiled. "Perhaps I am." "Good. Sit." On the papers before him lay not one chart, but several small notes written in different hands. One was Lath's, dry and spare. Another came from Samira, dictated perhaps to Eunice, or one of the nephews whose letters had improved. Another was in Sabir's more eager script, careful but unmistakably younger in its certainty. Sinbad recognized at once what had drawn him there before Ibrahim spoke of it. The islands had changed again. Not disastrously. That was not their manner. But with enough grace and persistence to ask for fresh attention. The warm warm season, early tides, Ibrahim said, tapping one page. 3 in succession from the southeast, then a wind that lay against them. The outer shell bar widened and then eased north. The west basket point remains useful, but less decisive. A new inward curve has begun forming, south of the old basin. Samira says the water there rests more deeply by evening than it did 2 years ago. Sinbad drew the papers closer. Lath's note, as always, was brief. West approach still honest, though less direct. Outer float moved twice in 1 month. New calm water forming behind South Reed shoulder. Suggest watching before building. Samira's note carried more bodily detail. The birds sit lower on the south shoulder now. At dusk, the water under the old west basket darkens later than it should. Eunice says the little fish are using the new cut by moonrise. We have not trusted it yet except by skiff. If Sinbad comes, bring a plain cloth, 2 more horn panels if found, finer wire mesh, and jars for covered oil. Do not bring men who wish to make the island stop. Sinbad read that line twice and smiled without meaning to. Sabir's note, written with the sincerity of one who wanted very much not to fail the truth, added, the shell path to the west basket remains good in mist, but the shell ridge to the south now shines first in evening light. I think the islands are beginning another sentence. Ibrahim watched him read. The boy writes better than some trained clerks. He listens better than some trained clerks too. Yes, Ibrahim said. That is why his lines breathe. For a while the 2 men sat with the notes between them and the late Basra light coming through the lattice in pale bars. Dust moved softly in it. Far below, on the street, a donkey bell rang and passed. Somewhere in the building, a scribe coughed over his work. At length Sinbad said, Then I should go. Ibrahim nodded as if the answer had been known before the question existed. Yes? Lath? The evening gull will sail after 6 days. Not south for broad trade this time. Only the chain, then the marsh edge, then north again with practical goods. That suits the islands. It does. The old man adjusted one of the notes on his knee. Take also this. He handed Sinbad a narrow board wrapped in cloth. When unwrapped, it proved to be cedar, smooth and pale, with a set of incised marks along one side. Tide crescents, shell lines, reed sprays, a little tower symbol, a floating basket. Smaller marks between them. I have made a seasonal board, Ibrahim said. Not for fixed reading, for pattern. If the old west turn fades and the south curve strengthens, these intervals may help more than a full chart. They can be held in the hand while looking outward, which is how such places should always be read. Sinbad ran his thumb over the carvings. They were spare, unpretending exact. I will take it. Good. Ibrahim leaned back a little and folded his hands. And take less ambition than you think useful. The warmer season makes men eager for large repairs. Resist that. Sinbad laughed softly. I will try. No, the old man said. Do not try. Simply remember that the islands are better at becoming themselves than you are at improving them. The correction was so perfectly Ibrahim that it filled the room with a low, tender humor. Sinbad bowed his head in acceptance. During the 6 days before departure, Basra seemed to move around him in layered currents. Outwardly, he did what any attentive merchant would do. He arranged accounts, settled small obligations, purchased lamp oil, plain cotton, reed paper, wax, copper mesh, horn panes, waxed cord, jars with good lids, bronze hooks, wool cloth for wrapping, and a packet of fine nails no larger than a thumbnail but perfectly formed. He chose no luxury goods. The islands never wanted those. He bought also a small brass-bound chest, shallow enough to carry by one person, with compartments fitted inside for current notes, carved boards, wax tablets, small tools, and wrapped lamps. It seemed to him as he handled it that the chest was not meant merely to store things. It was meant to travel with a route that knew movement as part of its own truth. He purchased, at the last moment, one more thing: a handbell of clear but gentle tone, a little finer than the old basin bell, with a simple wooden handle wrapped in blue thread. He did not know yet whether the islands required it, but the thought of soft sound moving through mist among reeds seemed right. The evening gull departed on a dawn, washed in pearl and honey, the river broad beneath a thin haze, the city still half softened by sleep. Leith stood at the stern with one hand on the tiller, while the crew loosed lines and shifted poles. Hamad stowed food jars beneath shade cloth. Sabir, now older in the shoulders and far steadier in the eye than when first he had climbed the standing tower, moved about the deck with the quiet familiarity of a young man who had discovered his preferred world was made of rope, lamp smoke, wet wood, and patient instruction. Sinbad felt at once the welcome of the vessel. Some boats receive a person not through warmth, but through order. The Evening Gull remained such a boat. Her deck smelled of oiled timber, faint salt, lamp brass, and dry rope. The little storage nook near the mast had been kept for the island chest and the wrapped horn panes. The lamp oil jars were wedged in a shaded line, each cushioned with old cloth. 2 bundles of plain cotton sat beside a coil of fine mesh wire. Nothing shifted loosely, nothing needed to. They passed from river to wider water with little ceremony, and the city gave way by degrees to the calmer grammar of sea. The first days were mild. Morning brought pale light over the water, and the faintest coolness before the heat grew. Noon turned the gulf into plates of brilliance, broken by moving lines of blue deeper than metal. Evening softened everything again. Flying fish flashed and vanished. A long-backed bird with dark wingtips passed low over the swell. Once, near sunset, a small school of silver fish ran in a sudden glimmer before the bow, as if the sea itself had shaken out a strip of bright cloth. Ibrahim had not come this time. His age no longer suited such returning, yet he was present aboard in other ways. The carved seasonal board lay wrapped by Sinbad's sleeping place. The notes in the brass-bound chest had been arranged according to the old man's hand. Leith, though he never said so, navigated the southward line with some of Ibrahim's caution in the set of his shoulders. Even Sabir seemed to have absorbed the old navigator's manner of pausing before claiming certainty. On the 4th evening, while Hamad stirred a pot of rice and lentils and the crew settled into that quiet usefulness which often follows a day of favorable wind, Leith came to sit near Sinbad by the stern rail. "The islands will have moved," he said. "Yes. We must not arrive hoping to be right." "No." The captain looked out across the fading western light. "It is a pleasant relief, sailing somewhere that insists a man remain teachable." Sinbad turned that sentence over like a smooth shell in the palm of thought. "It is?" Leith gave a low breath that might almost have been a laugh. "Most merchants do not pay for such relief." "Then most merchants are poorer than they imagine." That was all. The two men sat in the deepening dusk while the first stars appeared. Somewhere forward, Sabir was checking a lamp chimney with meticulous fingers. Water breathed against the hull. A single line of birds crossed northward, black against the soft copper of the west. By the seventh day, the coast had lowered into the familiar, complicated country of reed edge, marsh shoulder, sand tongues, pale flats, and scattered islands no map could fully tame for long. The sea's smell altered subtly. Open salt remained, but now braided through it came warm silt, green reed damp, shell, and the faint, almost sweet note that low coastlines sometimes breathe when water has passed through many living roots before meeting open light. Sinbad stood at the bow and felt his attention narrow, not into tension, but into readiness. Every color in the water seemed to matter. Every bird movement, every change in brightness, every ripple passing contrary to the broader flow. Toward afternoon, the first white birds appeared, then the silver line of reeds beyond them, and then, by patient increments, the drifting islands themselves. They had changed. That much was visible even before charts or notes could begin comparing. The long, pale eastern brightness no longer held the same shape. The shell gleam had indeed widened northward. A southern shoulder, once hardly more than a braid of silt and reeds, now lay broader and more articulate against the water. The West Basket Island seemed slightly reduced. The line of low islands no longer curved around the basin in quite the same gesture. Rather, there was now the feeling of a second inward invitation, farther south, as if the chain had begun turning one careful shoulder, while keeping the other still. Leith reduced sail. No one spoke much then. Nabil took soundings. Sabir watched the color seams. Sinbad held the latest notes ready beside the seasonal board. The old and newer understanding of the route stood together in his mind. Not the wish that the islands had remained as before, but the desire to enter truthfully as they currently were. By the time they reached the outer approaches, the first evening shadows had begun touching the shell bars. And there, just where Samira's notes suggested, the new pattern showed itself with a quiet certainty that felt almost like relief. The old outer float still held its place west of the deceptive brightness, but farther south, beyond the old West Basket Point, a darker, calmer line of water now curled inward behind a new reed shoulder. It was not ready yet for full trust. One could see that immediately, but it was there, and the islands were not hiding it. They were merely asking to be noticed without haste. The three existing lights burned that evening in their accustomed order, though Samira had clearly already adjusted two of them to speak more honestly to the altered shape. The outer float lay slightly farther south than last season. The west basket flame seemed lower. The standing tower, still steady, now gathered not only the old basin approach, but also the suggestion of the newer inward curve beyond. It was a subtle conversation, half old sentence and half new beginning. The evening gull entered by the old basin line at Leith's choosing. For no captain worthy of the name tests an unproven cut merely because it is visible. Yet as they glided inward under the three lights, Sinbad saw on the southern water the beginnings of a fourth relation waiting to be learned. Samira met them at the shell shelf. The sea and season had touched her too. A little more silver showed at her temples where the dark cloth did not cover. The skin of her hands, when she took the mooring line from Sabir, was more weathered than before, and perhaps more capable for it. Eunice stood behind her now, almost grown into his length, carrying himself with the same spare directness she had always had. One of the nephews, broader in the chest and less boyish than on Sinbad's previous visit, was tending the western lamp basket with the confident economy of habit. "So," Samira said after greeting them, "the islands have remembered they are not done moving." Sinbad smiled. "I came in case they needed witnesses." "They need listeners first." It was the best welcome he could have wanted. The basin itself had grown more settled in domestic ways. The central hut was better roofed. A second shelter on the south side showed fresh reed matting and a new drainage line. The standing tower had a sounder ladder. 2 extra oil jars sat beneath shade cloth. The shell path to the west point had been refreshed, and another, fainter shell line now hinted southward across firmer ground. The place was not more crowded. It was simply more inhabited by continuity. That first evening after their arrival, the work being too late to begin anew, they shared a meal on the raised platform between the old basin and the suggestion of the new one. Hamad unpacked bread, lentils, onion relish, and a dish of preserved lemon. Samira added dried fish and a bowl of reeds' tender inner shoots, blanched briefly and dressed with oil, which tasted of green water and spring. Eunice brought sweet well water from the southern seep to compare with the west well's cooler mineral tone. Leith listened. Sinbad looked, smelled, tasted, and let the islands speak their changes through all those quieter senses. After the meal, Samira took a stick and drew upon the shell sand. "This," she said, marking the old basin in the standing tower, "remains honest and useful. Not much change there, but here," she drew a second inward curve farther south. "The tide has been carrying and taking in a different manner since the second cool moon. At first we thought it only a new side seam, good for skiffs. Then fish began using it at dusk. Then the birds moved. Then the water behind the south shoulder stayed darker, even under high sun. We have taken the skiff through twice at high half-tide. No grounding, no scraping, only reeds touching the sides." "Depth?" Leith asked. "Enough for something smaller than the gull, enough for a cloth boat or marsh trader. Perhaps not more. Not yet." Ibrahim's seasonal board lay between them. Sinbad placed it beside Samira's drawing. The old tide crescents and shell symbols did not predict the change exactly, yet they seemed to leave room for it, which was its own kind of wisdom. "The question," Samira said, is whether we make this new curve part of the route or let it become itself longer before naming it. No one answered too quickly. The islands deserved better than immediate decisions. Eventually, Leith said, "We watch first, then mark lightly. A place should be invited into usefulness, not conscripted." Samira nodded. Good. That night the lanterns seemed to hold wider company than before. The outer float and west basket still spoke faithfully to the older approach, while the standing tower, by no action of its own, now seemed also to oversee the beginnings of another inward water. Moonlight lay pale on the southern shoulder. Reeds on that side stirred differently, making a whisper more continuous than the older basin reeds. Even in sleep, Sinbad felt that new whisper beneath his dreams. The next morning began the slow reading of the south curve. They took the skiff. Samira, Sinbad, Leith, Eunice, and Sabir. Nabil followed later with sounding line and extra stakes. The water there behaved unlike the old west approach. Instead of narrowing between shell brightness and reed line, it folded inward with gentler ambiguity, as though unsure yet whether it wanted to become a root or remain a private current. Fish moved through it in quick silver flickers. The water smelled a touch fresher, perhaps because a hidden seep joined it from under the southern reeds. A little stand of tamarisk, no more than shoulder height, had established itself on the inner bank, suggesting firmer ground below than the chart would ever have guessed. Samira paddled first. She knew the language of such water better than any of them. Sinbad sat with the sounding pole. Eunice watched the reeds. Sabir noted the shell gleam under the changing light. At first the curve seemed almost too soft to trust, but as they went deeper, it clarified. There were places where the reeds leaned aside naturally, where root mats held back silt, and where the darker channel cut straight enough for a boat to pass without forcing. There was even, behind the southern shoulder, a little still pool widening toward a new interior shelf, smaller than the old basin, shallower yet distinctly sheltered. The surface there held the sky in a different way, with less movement. Tiny fish gathered at its edges. A bird stepped among the reeds and lifted only at the last moment. Leith took a long breath through his nose. A south basin. Only beginning, Samira said. Yes. They did not rush to name it more fully than that. By noon they had sounded enough to know the south curve could serve skiffs, and very light craft at favorable tide. It could not yet replace the old basin, nor should it try. But its existence changed the route's future. The drifting chain was not merely eroding and surrendering, and it was also composing a second resting place within itself, as if the islands knew the value of giving their users more than one way to arrive. Back at the hut, Sinbad opened the brass-bound chest and drew out fresh paper. Under the old entries for the standing tower, west basket and outer float, he wrote a new heading: South Curve, observed, not yet declared. Then beneath it, deepens by evening behind South Reed Shoulder. Skiff proven twice. Fish and birds favor it. Reeds lean with inward pull after second watch. To be marked lightly only until another warm moon confirms. Samira watched him write and approved without comment. That afternoon, while the sun stood high and the islands asked for quieter labor, They turned to the practical matter of how one might speak this new curve without pretending it more fixed than it was. And the answer, as so often in these places, came not from a large building, but from a marriage of modest ideas. The old basin lights would remain. They had earned their truth. For the south curve, however, a different language might be needed. Not another tower at once. That would be too much commitment to a line still becoming. Not a basket set high on the new shoulder either, because the shoulder itself might shear in 2 flood seasons. Samira suggested low shell markers renewed each moon. Eunice proposed a pair of hanging reed lanterns that could be taken in and out according to the channel's mood. Sabir, thinking of the old floating marker, asked whether a double float relation might teach the eye more gently. One light refusing the wrong entry. Another, farther in, answering only when the water behind it was truly worth following. Lath considered this while repairing a line splice. A root that is young should be spoken in whispers, not declarations. They all sat with that. At length Sinbad said, "Then perhaps no permanent flame at first, only shell path by land and a removable south lamp for proven nights." Samira's face altered into her version of satisfaction, a small ease around the mouth, almost invisible unless one had learned to look for it. Yes, so the next days became days of making lightness. They gathered shell fragments and laid a southern shell path from the central huts toward the new shoulder. White side up where fog or moon shadow would most obscure the way. They wove 2 removable lantern sleeves from fresh reed, tighter than the old wind baffles because the south curve took the breeze differently. Sinbad and Eunice prepared a pair of slim stake sockets that could be driven in and withdrawn without troubling the root mats. Nabil mapped the depths not as lines of certainty, but as intervals. Safe for skiff at half and above, uncertain below. Watch fish turn. Trust the darker seam only after the second reed stand. Every phrasing resisted the temptation to sound final. Meanwhile, life in the old basin continued. Small trade still came, and because the route remained honest, it grew in the best possible way, modestly, almost shyly. A marsh dyer arrived with indigo-tinted rope and baskets. 2 salt carriers stopped in 1 week and left fine marsh salt, flat and pale, in exchange for cloth and lamp oil. A boat carrying plain glazed jars from a northern kiln used the old basin 3 nights running while waiting for a favorable outward tide, and its captain spent his days helping repair the standing tower's rain lip simply because he liked things to be sound wherever he slept. Even a little paper boat out of Basra, sent by one of Sinbad's own cautious associates, arrived one evening with fresh ledger sheets, wax, and a note written in a careful clerk's hand, asking whether the islands required more covered chests before the damp months. That note pleased Sinbad deeply, not because it proved influence, but because it proved understanding could travel without loudness. The seasons leaned onward. One evening under a half moon, when the west basket flame had just been lit, and the south shoulder glowed softly with late shell light, Samira asked Sinbad to walk with her to the new shell path. They went in near silence, I'm carrying no lamp because the moon and the standing tower's reflection gave enough. The path crossed firmer ground than before, then dipped toward the southern reeds where water could be heard moving in a slower, fuller murmur than the old basin channel ever made. Samira stopped where the shell line ended at the temporary stake sockets. "This is where my grandfather used to stand on certain flood nights," she said. Sinbad looked at her in mild surprise. "Here? Or near enough. Before my time, the islands had another south cut. Not this one, but similar," my mother said. "It opened for some years and then thinned. He never called it lost when it closed. He only said the islands had folded that sleeve of water away for a while." She crouched and put her fingers into the damp shell sand. "That is what people on still coasts do not understand. They think a place must either endure unchanged or disappear. But these islands are more like breathing. They widen, they narrow, they keep and release. The root survives because people remember the breathing, not the exact edge of every breath." The sentence entered Sinbad so gently that only later would he fully grasp how much it altered him. "Ibrahim would have liked that," he said. Samira's hand remained in the sand. "He taught some of it, and my mother taught the rest." A little fish moved in the south curve. The reeds gave their dry, silver whisper. From the old basin, the west basket light shone low and warm among the darker stems. When they returned, Hamid had tea brewing. Sabir sat on the platform with Eunice, copying the shell path marks into the margin of the ledger in little white strokes. Laith was tying off the removable south lantern sleeves. With the careful finality he gave all rope work. The whole basin seemed to be living in several times at once. The old route, the new route beginning, the remembered keepers, the present hands, the future children who might one day take these patterns as ordinary. That layered life was one of the deepest comforts the islands offered. Another moon passed. The south curve held. Not only held, but clarified. The water there remained gently deeper by evening. The fish continued to use it. A little more shell showed at the outer lip, but the inward seam remained dark and honest. They began, on nights when conditions were right and the tide fit, to set the removable south lamp just after dusk. A low woven lantern on a slim stake, lit only after someone had walked the shoulder and confirmed the line. It never pretended to permanence. That was part of its beauty. When the route suited, the lamp spoke. When the route needed quiet, the stake came out and the reeds reclaimed the edge. A few selected captains were taught the relation. Those with patient tempers understood and entered well. Others were simply guided to the old basin, which remained no insult. In time, the South Pool became a favored resting pocket for the marsh skiffs and cloth boats, while the older basin continued serving the broader draft craft. The chain had, in its drifting wisdom, given itself 2 chambers. Sinbad's ledger thickened. So did his affection. He had come again thinking perhaps he would help with one more season's adaptation, and then returned to Basra satisfied that the route could continue. Instead, he found that the islands kept teaching, even after their immediate needs were met. They taught through small, practical repetitions, how the shell markers looked under different moons, how a removable lamp fosters more honesty than a permanent one set too early. How households re-enter a place gradually through baskets, nephews, cloth wraps, and remembered jokes as much as through charts. How labor done with the expectation of future change feels different in the body, less like resistance, more like accompaniment. He began to understand that this, perhaps, was why the tale of the island stayed quieter than the tale of the ancient basin with its great elders, and the drifting chain did not offer the comfort of an older-than-time presence watching from warm depths. Instead, it offered the gentler, more demanding comfort of demonstrating that a moving place could still be kept lovingly without ever being pinned still. When warm season deepened, Ibrahim sent a final note southward by a cloth trader. The writing was less firm than before, but unmistakably his. Do not let neatness harden. If the south curve strengthens, teach it as a second voice, not a replacement for the first. Tell Sabir that the line of birds matters only when read with a shell. Tell Samira that the islands were always wiser than my better charts. Tell Sinbad that patience is not waiting. It is accompanying. Sinbad read the note twice under the hut shade, and then folded it very carefully into the cedar chest. And he did not know then whether it would be the last thing he ever received from the old navigator. The not knowing itself felt appropriate. Some relationships do not need formal endings to become complete. Still, the note stayed with him, especially that final line. Patience is not waiting, it is accompanying. The island had been saying the same thing in reeds and shell all along. By late summer, the rest of lanterns had become something rarer than mere restoration. It had become a practiced humility. Boats came, boats went. The outer float moved when needed. The west basket remained true enough. The standing tower took its old basin duty with renewed dignity. The south lamp spoke on the right nights and was silent on the wrong ones. The shell paths were refreshed. The wells were covered. The ledger grew. Households shared the labor. A trade remained useful and intentionally modest. No customs clerk arrived to fatten it into something louder. No ambitious merchant was invited to build a fixed quay. The route lived because everyone involved had learned that enough was enough. At last, as Laith had gently foretold long ago, the time came when Sinbad knew he must leave, not because the islands were failing, but because they no longer required his constant hints. That knowledge came to him not in one dramatic revelation, but in several quiet recognitions. One was seeing Eunice teach the south curve relation to a new marsh boy without consulting anyone older. He did it calmly, correctly, and with exactly the right amount of caution. Another was watching Sabir refuse a northern trader's suggestion that a permanent post be set at the south shoulder to save trouble. The boy, no, the young man now, answered, "The point of the lamp is not to save us from attention." Sinbad, listening from the shell shelf, felt something in him settle. A third was noticing that Samira had begun speaking of next season's reed cutting and oil storage, without first asking whether he would return by a certain moon. She assumed the work would continue because it belonged there now. That assumption was the surest sign of all. He spoke first with Laith. The captain was aboard the Evening Gull in the outer lane. checking the wear of a stern line by lamplight. Dusk had just begun. The outer float glimmered low. The west basket answered. The standing tower was ready. Farther south, the removable lamp had not yet been set, because the tide was still too low to promise anything honest. "I think," Sinbad said, "that after the next cool moon, I should return north and let the route breathe without me for a season." Leith passed the line once more through his hand before answering. "Yes." "That easy? Would you prefer resistance?" "There is none. You have done what could be done without turning yourself into a pillar. Now the route belongs to those whose footsteps remain when traders pass on." Sinbad leaned on the rail beside him. "I will still send oil, cloth, paper, tools, of course, and return now and then. Also, of course." Leith looked out at the lights. "A man may love a harbor best by refusing to make it his mirror." The words were so quietly exact that Sinbad felt gratitude more than surprise, and when he told Samira, she only nodded. "The islands are not asking you to stay still," she said. "That would be unlike them." Then, after a little while, she added, "Come in the cool season if the birds shift and we send word. Otherwise send practical things and don't send fools." It was in her language a blessing. The final weeks before departure were full of the gentle intensifying that accompanies good endings. Not a rush, but a deepened noticing. Sinbad spent long mornings copying notes carefully into 3 ledgers. One for the central hut, one to travel with Leith, one for Basra. He and Eunice repaired the hinge on the brass-bound chest and lined one compartment with extra waxed cloth against damp. Sinbad climbed the standing tower and replaced 2 ladder pegs with such competence that Leith only watched once and then returned to his own work. Samira and the nephews cut a new stand of reed for future lantern shades and hung them under shade where wind could cure them slowly. Hamad taught one of the boys his method for storing dried fish above the damp line using twisted reed loops instead of nails, because metal rusts where reed learns. One evening, a narrow boat came carrying not goods but Ibrahim's astrolabe wrapped in linen, sent northward by a trusted pilot with a note. The note was very short. "My hands no longer require this. The islands may have it if they wish. If not, let Sinbad keep it for places that still prefer sky to neat walls." No more. Samira unfolded the linen and held the brass instrument in both palms, and the last of the day's light ran across its circles and cutwork. The whole platform went quiet. "It should not stay shut in Basra," she said softly. "No," Sinbad answered. So they placed it in the cedar chest, not as a relic, but as part of the route's gathered wisdom. Chart, current notes, carved boards, shell marks, and now also the instrument that measured sky, for those who knew how to let measure remain humble. The final evening before Sinbad's departure arrived clear and mild, as if the islands themselves wished no weather to speak too loudly over the leave-taking. The day had gone to ordinary tasks. A salt boat came and left. Water was drawn. The south lamp was tested and set aside until dusk. The shell path by the new curve was refreshed in 2 places where a night tide had dimmed it. The outer float line was checked, and the standing tower tray cleaned. Nothing ceremonial, yet by late afternoon, everyone seemed to move with a little more awareness, as people do when a known chapter is folding gently toward its close. They shared the evening meal on the raised platform between the two basins. Laith had moored the evening gull in the outer lane and come in by skiff. Hamad brought rice scented lightly with cinnamon, lentils, onions, pickled herbs, and flatbread warmed over a low iron plate. Samira added fish cooked simply with oil and marsh greens. Eunice drew sweet water from the South Sea because, as he said with deadpan seriousness, it seems a good night for the newer water. Everyone accepted this as both practical and fitting. The lanterns were lit in their full relation. Outer float first, low on the darkening water. West basket next, warm in the reeds. Standing tower after, steady above the old basin. Then, when the tide had risen enough and Sabir himself walked the shoulder to confirm it, the removable south lamp was set and kindled. 4 modest lights. No more than that. No need for more. Across the chain they made a sentence of guidance, not fixed, not boastful, not the same as the year before, and therefore truer. Under the moon, their reflections trembled across channels, old and new. Shell bars glowed pale. Reeds moved in silver whisper. The basins rested, one elder and one young, each speaking its own soft welcome. They ate. They talked a little. Some meals are fuller without many words. A fish jumped once beyond the south shoulder and was gone. A bird crossed the moon. Far out beyond the outer bars, one could just hear the broader sea breathing behind all the more intimate waters of the chain. After the bowls were washed, Sinbad walked alone, first to the old basin, then to the new. At the old basin he stood beneath the standing tower and looked at the water which had received him seasons before when the first renewed lantern trembled above it. It had not changed its nature. Still calm, still inward, still the place where the first restored honesty had taken visible flame. At the new basin he stood by the temporary south stake and watched the younger water hold the lamp's small woven glow. It was not as deep, not as settled, yet it had already become itself enough to guide certain boats gently home. Between the two basins lay the whole lesson of the islands. Not replacement, but accompaniment. Not one truth erasing another, but an older truth, making room for a younger one beside it. When he returned to the platform, Samira was there, waiting with the carved current board he had first received from Ibrahim, and the newer board she herself had made for the south curve. "Take one," she said. "Leave one." He looked at the 2 pieces of cedar in her hands. The first carried the old relation of outer float, west basket, standing tower, shell path, wells. The newer one held the south shoulder symbols added in her stronger, squarer cuts. "If I take the older," he said, "the islands keep the newer speech." She nodded. "That seems right." So he tucked Ibrahim's board into his sash and returned Samira's to her, where it belonged among the living root. It felt less like receiving a keepsake than like carrying forward one layer of a continuing conversation. Late that night, after everyone else had settled or gone aboard the evening gull, Sinbad sat one last time with Laith at the shell shelf. The captain had brought the little blue thread bell from the chest and hung it near the standing tower path, where it could be lifted in mist without searching. Its tone, when tested once, had gone across the water like a single polished drop of sound. Then silence resumed. Laith rested his forearms on his knees and watched the four lights. "What will you say of this place when people ask?" he said. Sinbad considered. "The truth." Laith glanced at him sidelong. "And which truth is that? The one merchants can understand, or the one reeds prefer?" Sinbad smiled. "I will say it is a resting place among drifting islands where fixed charts are rude and modest lights are wise. I will say the root asks patience and repays it. I will say water, shell, reeds, birds, and households all have equal claim to the way it is kept. I will say the islands did not drift away. Only certain kinds of certainty did." The captain let out a long, contented breath. "Good." Then after a while he added, "That is a description, fit to protect a place." The moon climbed higher. The south lamp dimmed slightly as the tide reached its turning, but Sabir saw it in time and trimmed it with the deftness of long practice. Over the old basin, the standing tower held steady. The west basket shone low. The outer float shifted by a hand's width, and then rested again on its mooring. Everything moved a little. Everything remained in relation. In the morning, Sinbad departed. The leave-taking was not sorrowful in the way port songs sometimes pretend. It was gentler than that. Samira stood by the shell path with Eunice and the nephews. Sabir was already aboard the evening gull, though he would go only as far as the marsh edge this time, before returning south with another boat and a packet of new wick. Hamad handed down a wrapped loaf and a little jar of pickled reeds for the road north, as if there were such a thing as a road, simple enough to suit that phrase here. Laith sat in the stern of the skiff, ready to take him out to the vessel. Before boarding, Sinbad walked once more to each of the four lights in daylight. He touched the mooring line of the outer float and saw it lay true. He checked the west basket frame and the shell path near it. He climbed the standing tower and let his hand rest on the old wood beneath the tray, feeling the warmth the sun had already laid into it. Then he crossed the south shoulder and lifted the temporary stake socket from its place, just to feel how light it remained, how uncommitted to permanence, how right for its still forming water. He set it back carefully. From the highest point near the tower, he looked over the chain one last time. The islands lay in long, pale relations under the broad morning sky. No line remained exactly as before. The old basin held its inward calm. The south curve hinted at another future. Reeds silvered, shell bars glowed, birds rose and settled in little movements no chart could order fully. The whole place looked neither fragile nor solid. It looked alive. He descended then and stepped into the skiff. As Laith rowed them outward, the route unmade itself by a scale just as it always had. The standing tower grew small. The west basket became only a reed dark point. The shell paths vanished first, as such intimate truths must. Then the southern shoulder and the old basin began blending back into the larger chain. Soon the light's positions remained only in memory and in the mind's newly trained habit of relation. The islands themselves flattened into pale bars and greenish seams. Then even those softened into the low, shimmering ambiguity by which strangers had once judged them lost. Sinbad did not feel they were lost. He felt, more strongly than ever, that they were continuing. The evening gull moved northward with the tide. Water widened. The coast lowered, and then drew away. By noon, the drifting chain was no longer visible, except perhaps to a heart that had learned how to keep such places lit within it. Sabir came aft while coiling a line and stood quietly near him. "It looks empty from here," the young man said. "Yes," said Sinbad, "but it is not." "No." Sabir smiled a little and returned to his work. Days later, when Basra received him again with its river smell, its counting rooms, its lifted jars, its rope yards, and its ordinary complicated life, Sinbad felt no division between the wide city and the quiet chain. The islands had entered his understanding too deeply for that. He still worked in trade. He still wrote numbers, chose cargoes, studied routes, and kept men to their promises. But now, and whenever a merchant spoke carelessly of unreliable shores or vanishing ways, Sinbad listened for the hidden stiffness in the phrase. Often it meant only that the speaker wished the world to stop moving long enough for convenience to profit. In the years that followed, he kept faith with the drifting islands in all the ways that suited them best. He sent practical goods north and south with trustworthy hands: oil, cloth, jars, paper, mesh, hooks, wax, rope, bell parts, reed knives. He refused those who wanted to turn the route into a faster market lane. He copied the current notes only for captains who understood that a moving marker was not a defect. He returned when called, and sometimes when not called, but moved by season and memory. Each time he found the chain altered, and yet more itself. One year the south curve had deepened and required a second shell line. Another year, the west basket stood a little farther inland because reeds had thickened where once there had been open water. Once the standing tower had been re-skinned with new reed and cloth and looked from the basin below, both entirely changed and utterly the same. Samira grew older there, though never softer in the useless sense. Eunice became a keeper of notes as much as reeds. Sabir passed between city quays and island shell paths with equal ease, carrying with him the rare gift of understanding that neither world needed to mock the other. Leith's evening gull continued her modest, faithful circuits until another younger captain, taught properly, took some of her roots, and in a cedar drawer in Basra, wrapped in cloth, Sinbad kept Ibrahim's carved board and the first notes of the restored chain, not as relics, but as reminders that the truest charts are often those which leave room for change. Years later still, when people would ask him in calmer moments whether he had ever truly seen islands drift away, he would answer them only if they asked in the right tone. If they wanted marvel, he gave them little. If they wanted wonder, he told them this: there were islands south of the common routes, where the shell bars moved like patient thoughts, and the reed lines changed by season. Men called them lost because they preferred stillness. But the islands were never lost. They were only living in a manner that required company rather than control. And once, when I was still young enough to believe that restoration meant putting things back, I learned there that some places must be loved, forward instead, guided by lights that can move, by notes that admit correction, and by people willing to keep faith not with the exact shape of yesterday, but with the honest relation of all things present now. He did not often say more than that. He did not need to, for in quiet hours, especially in the hush before sleep, or in the mild silver interval after dusk, when a harbor first lights its lamps, the story of the drifting islands returned to him complete enough without speech. He would remember the outer float trembling low on dark water, the west basket warm among reeds, the standing tower above the elder basin, the removable south lamp glowing gently where a younger curve had begun. He would remember shell paths under mist, the cool sweetness of the west well, and the newer sweetness of the south seep, the carved symbols under his thumb, Samira's dry voice, Laith's restrained certainty, Sabir's growing patience, and Ibrahim's final truth, that patience is not waiting, it is accompanying. And because the story asked no loud ending, it continued in him as the best harbor stories do, not as a single last scene, but as a long, soft afterlight. A boat enters under modest lamps. A stake is moved by 2 oars because the birds have shifted. A shell path is refreshed before moonrise. A chart margin is widened to admit uncertainty. A household returns by way of baskets, nephews, and covered oil jars. A merchant learns that enough may be more sacred than abundance. An old navigator's neatness is amended by humility. Islands drift. Relations remain. The lights are tended. The water, though changing, stays kind to those who approach gently. So if, on some imagined night, you were to stand on the deck of a small, quiet vessel and see ahead, not one fixed lighthouse, but several soft, low flames laid among reeds and shell bars, one on moving water, one inland, one perhaps newly kindled where the channel has lately deepened, you would know already what sort of place you approached, not a place that had drifted away from the world, only one that had drifted away from impatience. And if you entered it carefully, with your voice lowered and your hands ready to be corrected by the water, you might find there what Sinbad found in those lesser-known years before his name grew heavy with other tellings, that some of the most faithful places on earth are not those that stand still, but those that keep changing without ever forgetting how to guide the quiet traveler home.